The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, Wade Creed had already decided she was trouble. He hadn't even met the woman yet. He just knew his brother had sent for a mail-order bride from back east. Some stranger with no name that meant anything, no family worth mentioning, no history that anyone had bothered to check. And that was exactly the problem. Silas had been so deep in grief since Clara died that he'd stopped thinking clearly. He'd signed papers and sent money to a matchmaking agency without asking a single hard question, and now some unknown woman was on her way to Black Ridge Ranch to slide herself into the life Clara had left behind. Wade stood at the post office counter in Harlow, Wyoming, reading his brother's letter a second time, and what he felt wasn't concern. It was fury. If you think you can walk into my brother's house and take what isn't yours, he thought, you don't know what you're walking into. He folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket, and rode back toward the ranch to make sure he was there when she arrived. He wanted to see her face. He wanted her to understand from the very first moment that she was not welcome. Well, before we go any further, if this kind of story moves you, if you've ever watched someone fight for a place they deserved and wondered whether they'd make it, please subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Every story here is made for you. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to Wyoming and to the woman no one expected. Evelyn Hart had been traveling for 11 days. She didn't count them to complain. She counted them the way a person counts the last of their money, carefully, aware that each one brought her closer to a point where there was no going back. The stagecoach from Cheyenne had broken an axle outside a town called Ridgecroft, and the passengers had spent 2 nights at a boarding house while a replacement wheel was found. Then the weather had turned ugly, the kind of late-fall Wyoming cold that didn't warn you before it arrived, and the road north toward Harlow became uncertain enough that the driver refused to push on until the frost lifted. Evelyn had sat in the boarding house parlor with her single trunk and her single bag, and had done what she always did when she was waiting in a strange place. She watched other people and stayed quiet. She was 26 years old. She was not beautiful in the way that made men turn their heads in a crowd, but she had a face that people trusted. Wide-set gray eyes, a steady mouth, dark hair she kept pinned back without fuss. She was thin in the way that people get thin when they've been surviving rather than living. Her coat was good quality, but old. Her boots had been resoled twice. She had $31 to her name. She also had a piece of paper with an address and a name written on it in the cramped handwriting of the matchmaking agency back in Philadelphia. Silas Creed, Black Ridge Ranch, outside Harlow, Wyoming Territory. She'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She wasn't romantic about what she was doing. She'd stopped being romantic about most things by the time she was 22. What she knew was this. She was a woman alone with a damaged reputation in a city where every person of consequence had already decided what kind of woman she was. And she had exactly one chance to go somewhere far enough away that the story hadn't traveled ahead of her. Wyoming was far enough. She told herself that every time the stage hit a rut and her back ached and the woman across from her gave her the sideways look that strangers gave women who were traveling alone without a clear reason. Wyoming is far enough. She believed it, mostly. When the stage finally pulled into Harlow, Evelyn was the last passenger off. The town was smaller than she'd expected. A main street with a general store, a post office, a saloon, a livery, a church, and a scattering of houses set back from the road like they were trying to keep their distance from each other. The mountains in the distance were already white. The sky overhead was the particular shade of gray that meant more weather was coming. She stood on the wooden sidewalk with her trunk beside her and looked around for someone who might be Silas Creed. There was no one waiting. She'd been delayed by nearly a week. She'd sent a telegram from Ridgecroft explaining the axle situation, but she had no way of knowing whether it had arrived or whether Silas Creed had simply stopped expecting her and moved on with whatever version of his life didn't include a mail-order bride showing up from Pennsylvania. The possibility had occurred to her on the second night at the boarding house, lying awake listening to the wind. She'd decided that if no one came, she would find the ranch herself. She was not a woman who waited for rescue. She had learned that lesson early and thoroughly. She asked the stagecoach driver if he knew the Black Ridge Ranch. "Creed Place," he said, not quite looking at her. "About 9 miles north. Road forks at the Cottonwood stand. You take the left fork." "Is there someone who could take me out there?" He looked at the sky. "Today?" Today. He considered it the way men considered things they didn't want to do. I'll ask Hank at the livery. He might take you for $2. Hank did take her, for $2.50, driving a wagon that rattled so badly she had to hold her trunk down with one hand the entire way. He didn't talk much. She didn't press him. The landscape was doing enough speaking. That vast Wyoming flatness that felt like it went on forever until you realized the mountains were closer than they looked, and the sky was bigger than anything you'd imagined, and the wind moved through the dry grass in long, slow waves like something breathing. She looked at it and felt something she hadn't expected. Not hope, exactly. Not fear, either. Something quieter. Something like recognition. This is what the edge of everything looks like. She smelled the ranch before she saw it. Smoke, livestock, the particular mix of hay and cold air, and worked animals that meant a working place. Then the house came into view. It was a solid structure, 2 stories, stone foundation, a covered porch running across the front. And it had clearly been built by someone who knew what they were doing. But it had the look of a place that had stopped being cared for. The porch railing was loose. One shutter hung at an angle. The kitchen garden along the south side had gone to dead stalks that no one had cleared. The barn was in better shape. The fencing around the nearest paddock was maintained, so Silas Creed was keeping the animals alive, at least. But the house was telling a different story. Hank pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard and set the brake. He looked at the house the way people look at things they're not going to comment on. "You need me to wait?" Evelyn looked at the front door. She heard something from inside. A baby crying. Not the healthy, irritated crying of a well-fed infant who wanted attention. The thin, desperate crying of a child who had been crying for a long time already. "No," she said. "Thank you." She was off the wagon before he could reply. She didn't knock. Later, she would think about that. The fact that she didn't knock. The fact that she heard that sound and her body just moved without waiting for permission. She pushed the front door open and stepped inside. The house was cold. Not the cold of a morning that hadn't warmed up yet, but the deeper cold of a fire that had been out for hours. The grate in the sitting room held ash, nothing else. The windows let in pale gray light that made everything look like it was underwater. In the middle of the room, standing absolutely still with her arms wrapped around herself, was a girl of about 7. She had dark hair and braids that had come half undone, and she was wearing a coat over her nightgown, which meant she'd put on the coat herself, probably hours ago, because no one had told her to get dressed. She was staring at the door to what was probably the back bedroom. The crying was coming from behind that door. The girl turned and looked at Evelyn. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then the girl said, "Are you the lady from the letter?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "My name is Evelyn. What's your name?" "June." "June." Evelyn looked toward the bedroom door. The crying had a quality to it that made her stomach tighten, a kind of frantic, breathless quality that she associated with fever in young children. "Is the baby in there?" "Millie." June's voice was very careful. The careful voice of a child who had learned not to show too much. "She's been crying since last night. She's hot. I tried to put a wet cloth on her, but I didn't know how hot the water was supposed to be." Evelyn crossed the room. She had no idea what she was walking into. She had no particular training with sick infants. What she had was a younger brother she'd helped raise, while her mother worked 2 jobs, and a memory of what fever looked like on a small face, and a certainty that standing still was not an option. She opened the bedroom door. The baby, Millie, was in a wooden crib near the window. She was 5 or 6 months old at most, and she was burning. Evelyn could feel the heat from her before she even touched her. The child's face was flushed a deep, angry red, and her little hands kept grasping at nothing, and the crying had gone up and then down to a kind of weak, exhausted sound that was somehow worse than the loud crying. Evelyn picked her up. The baby startled, quieted for half a second, the instinctive pause of an infant registering a new smell, new hands, and then resumed crying, but differently, less desperate, more present. Evelyn held her against her chest and put the back of her hand to the baby's forehead and thought, "This child needs help now." "How long has she been like this?" she asked. "Since yesterday evening," June said from the doorway. "Maybe before. I don't know. Pa was in the barn, and when I went to get him, he said he'd be in soon, but..." She stopped. Where is he now? June pointed, not toward the front door, toward the back of the house. Still in the barn, she said quietly. Evelyn stood in the cold bedroom holding a burning baby and processed that information. She'd been told, through the matchmaking agency, that Silas Creed was a widower with 2 young daughters. She knew his wife had died earlier in the year. She hadn't really thought through what that might mean in practical terms, what grief of that specific kind did to a person, what it looked like from the outside. She was looking at it now. It looked like a little girl in a coat over her nightgown. It looked like a cold grate and unwashed dishes and a baby who had been crying since yesterday. It looked like a man in a barn who couldn't make himself come inside. Evelyn didn't feel judgment. She had enough of her own failures to know that people didn't collapse because they were weak. They collapsed because the weight was exactly the wrong shape. But she felt something else very clearly: urgency. She carried Millie back into the main room and said, "June, I need you to show me where you keep the blankets, the clean ones, if there are any. And I need to know if there's water in the kitchen pump or if I need to get it from outside." June blinked. She'd clearly been waiting for someone to tell her what to do for a long time. "The blankets are in the chest at the top of the stairs. The pump works, but it's slow in cold weather." "Good. That's good. Can you get me 2 blankets while I start on the fire?" "You're not going to leave?" June said. The question was so direct it stopped Evelyn for a moment. She looked at this 7-year-old with her come-undone braids and her careful voice and her coat over her nightgown and felt something settle in her chest. "No," she said. "I'm not going to leave." She rebuilt the fire one-handed, with Millie against her left shoulder. It was not elegant. She knocked the ash bucket sideways, spilled kindling across the floor, had to restack it twice before it caught. But it caught. And once it caught, she fed it steadily until the room began to warm. She found the kitchen pump, and it was slow, just as June had said, but it worked. She got a basin of water and wetted a cloth and began the work of bringing Millie's temperature down. Cool cloth on the forehead, on the back of the neck, behind the ears, replaced when it warmed, replaced again. She found the pantry. It was nearly empty. There was dried beans, a small amount of flour, cornmeal, a tin of salt, half a jar of molasses, and a few sorry-looking root vegetables in a basket on the floor. Someone had meant to restock and hadn't gotten around to it, or hadn't been able to make themselves go into town. She found a pot and started beans soaking. She found enough flour and lard to make something approximating biscuits if she stretched it. She built up the kitchen stove as well, so both fires were working, and the house began slowly, reluctantly, to come back to some version of itself. June stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the sitting room and watched her with those careful eyes. "Have you eaten today?" Evelyn asked. A pause. "I had some bread this morning." "How much bread?" "A piece." Evelyn looked at the flour situation and recalculated. "I'm going to make you something now," she said, "before the beans are done. Sit down." June sat. Evelyn made cornmeal mush from what she had, with a spoonful of molasses stirred through, and put it in front of June without ceremony. The girl ate it quickly in a way that suggested she'd been hungry for longer than just today. Evelyn kept one hand on Millie, kept track of the fire, kept the wet cloth cycling. She didn't think about the situation she'd arrived into. She didn't think about what she'd expected versus what she'd found. She didn't think about Silas Creed in the barn, or about the matchmaking agreement, or about what any of this meant for her future. She thought about the baby's temperature and whether it was coming down and what she would do if it wasn't. That was enough thinking for now. The door opened just as the light outside was going gray. She heard it before she saw him. The particular sound of boots on a wooden threshold, the pause of someone stopping, because what they'd walked into wasn't what they'd braced for. Evelyn was sitting in the chair nearest the fire with Millie in her lap. The baby had finally stopped crying about 20 minutes earlier, falling into the shallow, restless sleep of a sick child. The room was warm. The kitchen smelled of beans and cornmeal. June was asleep on the settee, still in her coat. Evelyn looked up. Silas Creed was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that had once probably been open and now was not. He had dark circles under his eyes and a beard that had passed the point of being deliberate. His coat was dirty from the barn. His hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly, not from cold but from something else. He stood in the doorway and looked at her holding his daughter, and looked at his older daughter asleep on the settee, and looked at the lit fire and the warmth that hadn't been in this room in she couldn't guess how long. He didn't say anything. Evelyn didn't say anything either. The silence went on long enough that it had texture. Then he said, in a voice that was rough from either disuse or emotion or both, "You're the woman from Philadelphia." "Yes," she said. "Evelyn Hart." He looked at Millie. "How bad is the fever?" "It was very bad this afternoon. It's come down some. She needs watching through the night, and she needs a doctor tomorrow if it isn't better." He nodded, very slowly, like a man receiving information that required more processing than he currently had capacity for. He stepped inside and closed the door. He moved to where June was sleeping and stood there looking at his daughter for a moment in a way that Evelyn didn't look at directly because it felt private. "I should have," he started. He didn't finish the sentence. "The beans will be ready in another hour," Evelyn said. "There's enough for a meal. We'll need to go to town for supplies tomorrow, weather permitting." Another pause. "You're not what I expected," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Neither is this." He almost smiled. It wasn't much of a smile, barely a movement at the corner of his mouth, but it was there. "I'll get another log for the fire," he said. "There's a good stack on the porch. June showed me." He went out, came back with the wood, built up both fires. He moved around the house the way men move when they've been away from a place they're ashamed of neglecting, noticing every evidence of their absence, not commenting on any of it. He ate the beans when they were ready, across the table from Evelyn, who ate standing up because Millie had woken again and wanted to be held upright. He told her, without her asking, that his wife's name had been Clara. She didn't push him, she just listened. When the meal was done and Millie was settled again and June had been carried to her proper bed, Silas stood in the kitchen and said, "I can make up the spare room for you." "I'd appreciate that," Evelyn said. He made up the spare room. It was a plain room, a bed, a chest of drawers, a hook on the wall. But it was private, and it had a window that looked toward the mountain. And when Evelyn finally set down her bag and sat on the edge of the bed and took off her boots, she let herself exhale for the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach. She had expected a cold marriage with a stranger. She'd found something stranger and harder and more immediately urgent than that. She didn't know what it meant yet. She only knew that the baby's fever had come down a degree, and the fires were lit, and there was food in the pot. That would have to be enough for tonight. She woke at 2 in the morning because Millie was crying again. She heard it through the wall, that thin, worn-out cry that told her the fever had spiked back up. She was out of bed and moving before she'd fully made the decision to move, out into the cold hallway in her stocking feet, into the baby's room. Silas was already there. He was standing at the crib with his back to the door, and he was doing something she didn't expect. He was talking to the baby in a low, half-broken voice, telling her it was going to be all right, telling her he was there, telling her he was sorry, and his voice cracked on that last word in a way that Evelyn felt in her own chest. She stopped in the doorway. He heard her. He didn't turn around. "Fever's back up," he said. "I know. Let me." He stepped back. She moved to the crib and picked up Millie and began the cycle again. Cloth, water, patience, temperature management. And Silas stood against the wall with his arms crossed and watched with the expression of a man who doesn't know how to help and can't stand that he doesn't know. "You're not helpless," she said without looking up. "There's a basin in the kitchen. Get me fresh cold water." He went. He came back with the basin. He held it while she worked. Neither of them said anything for a long time. The ranch settled around them, the beams contracting in the cold, the wind moving against the windows. Outside, nothing, just Wyoming darkness and the stars that came with it. "She looks like her mother," Silas said finally. It wasn't said to Evelyn exactly. It was said to the room. Evelyn kept her eyes on Millie. "She's going to be all right." "You don't know that." "No," she said, "I don't. But that's what you say, and then you do everything in your power to make it true." He looked at her. She looked back. Something passed between them that neither of them had language for. Not yet, not this early, not in this configuration, but it was there. It was the particular recognition of two people who have both spent a long time alone holding things together with not enough tools and not enough help. Millie's breathing slowly evened out. Her temperature, another hour later, came down again. By 4 in the morning, the baby was truly sleeping. Not the restless sick sleep, but something deeper, something that meant the worst of that particular wave had passed. Silas sat in the chair by the crib. Evelyn sat on the floor beside the chair with her back against the wall. She should have gone back to her room. There was no reason to stay. The crisis had passed for now. She stayed. Neither of them spoke. The fire in the room had burned down to embers and neither of them got up to rebuild it. The cold came back gradually, and they both sat in it and neither of them moved. At some point, Evelyn fell asleep where she was, sitting against the wall. When she woke, there was a blanket over her shoulders. She didn't know who had put it there. She looked at Silas, who was also asleep in the chair, and at Millie, who was breathing steadily, and at the gray light beginning to come through the window. She sat under the blanket in the cold Wyoming morning and thought, "This is not what you expected." And then more quietly, "No, but here you are." She got up, she went to the kitchen, she started the stove and she started the coffee, and she began another day. The coffee had become a kind of language between them. Evelyn noticed it first around the fourth morning. The way Silas would come in from the early chores and not say anything, just move to the stove and pour himself a cup. And if the pot was already hot, it meant she'd been up before him. And if it wasn't, he'd make it without comment and leave a second cup on the counter where she'd find it when she came down. No words about it, no acknowledgement, just the cup sitting there in the cold kitchen, still steaming. Small things become significant when two people have no shared language yet. They were two strangers living in close quarters with a sick baby and a watchful 7-year-old, and they had decided, without discussing it, to be careful with each other. Not distant, they were too busy for distance, but careful. The way you're careful around a thing you're not sure of yet. Millie's fever broke properly on the third day. It broke the way those things break. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the small hours of a Tuesday morning when Evelyn went in to check on her and put her hand to the baby's forehead and found it cool. Just cool. Not burning, not clammy, just cool and dry and the right temperature for a sleeping infant. She stood there in the dark for a long moment with her hand against Millie's head, and she felt her own knees go a little unsteady with relief. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been wound around the worry of it until it was gone. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands together in her lap and just breathed. The next morning, Silas came in from the barn, and Evelyn told him. He nodded once, and something in his face did something complicated that he controlled quickly. He poured his coffee and drank half of it standing at the counter with his back to her. "Thank you," he said. To the wall, essentially. "She did most of the work herself," Evelyn said. "Babies are tougher than they look." He turned around then and looked at her for a moment, and she could see him trying to find the right words for something and not finding them. And she let him off the hook by asking whether they needed to go into town for supplies before the next cold front came in. They did. They went together, with June and Millie bundled up in the wagon, and the trip was quiet for the most part. Silas drove, Evelyn sat beside him with Millie in her lap. June sat in the wagon bed singing something to herself under her breath that was half song and half invented nonsense. And it was, objectively, one of the stranger mornings of Evelyn's life. Riding into a small Wyoming town she didn't know beside a man she'd barely spoken to, carrying a baby she wasn't related to, shopping for a household she hadn't asked to inherit. Strange. And yet something about it felt less foreign than she'd expected. She was doing something. That was the part that helped. As long as she was doing something, the flour, the salt, the extra lamp oil, the length of cloth that June had requested with an unexpected specificity, not the blue one, the gray is warmer. She didn't have to think about what she was or wasn't. Silas paid for most of it. He handed her money before they went in and said she should get what the house needed, just like that, as if she already had standing to know what the house needed. She bought what the house needed. She also bought a small packet of dried chamomile because it was useful for calming a fussy baby, and she'd been out of it for 2 days, and she'd noticed. The woman behind the counter at the general store looked at her with undisguised curiosity. "You're the new Mrs. Creed?" Evelyn opened her mouth and closed it. She and Silas hadn't been married. The arrangement was... She wasn't sure, actually, what the arrangement was, now that she was thinking about it in the middle of the general store. The matchmaking agency had set up a correspondence. There had been an understanding, but no ceremony had taken place, no license had been signed, and no conversation about it had happened since she'd arrived. "I'm Evelyn Hart," she said. The woman, her name tag said Marion, smiled with a particular kind of small-town warmth that contained, Evelyn estimated, about 40% actual warmth and 60% investigation. Well, it's good that Silas has someone out there. Those girls need a woman in the house. They do, Evelyn agreed, neutrally. She paid for the chamomile and moved on. In the wagon on the way back, with June asleep against the supplies and Millie drowsing in her lap, Evelyn said, "The woman at the store called me Mrs. Creed." Silas kept his eyes on the road. A long pause. "What did you say?" "I said my name." Another pause. The horses moved. Wyoming came past them on both sides, flat and brown and enormous. "We should talk about that," he said finally. "The arrangement." "Yes," she agreed. "We should." But neither of them said anything else about it that day, because by the time they got home, Millie was hungry, and June had woken up in a bad mood for reasons she refused to explain, and one of the horses had gotten into the fence somehow and needed attention, and the conversation dissolved into the practical demands of an afternoon, which was, Evelyn was learning, how most important conversations got delayed on a working ranch. You meant to talk about something, and then the animals needed feeding. What? She had been at Black Ridge Ranch for 2 weeks when she found the box. She hadn't been snooping. She'd been cleaning. The spare bedroom had needed it, and then the hallway. And then, because she was already there, and the hall closet had been producing a faint smell that concerned her, she'd opened the hall closet to investigate. The smell was nothing. A bag of onions that had gone past saving, tucked behind a pair of old boots. But on the shelf above the boots, pushed to the back, was a wooden box about the size of a hat box. And when she moved the boots to get to the onion bag, the box shifted and the lid came partly open and she saw what was inside. Letters. Dozens of them, bound with kitchen twine. And photographs. And a small dried flower, the kind you pressed between the pages of a book, though there was no book. She understood immediately what she was looking at. She put the lid back carefully and put the box exactly where she'd found it and shut the closet door. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Clara. She had known, abstractly, that there had been a woman here before her. She had been living with the evidence of it every day. The particular way the kitchen was organized, which wasn't Evelyn's way but worked well enough that she hadn't changed it. The small handmade curtains in the baby's room that were careful and competent in a way that spoke of someone who'd cared about the details. The worn spot on the floor in front of the stove where a woman had stood for years cooking meals in the same spot. The box made it concrete. Clara had been a person who kept letters, who saved flowers, who was loved enough to be written to, frequently, by someone. Evelyn went back downstairs and didn't say anything about the box. But it sat in her thoughts, the way things do when they've changed the shape of your understanding without giving you anywhere to put them. The ranch work was real, and it was hard, and Evelyn did more of it than Silas had expected. She told him, during their initial correspondence, that she had grown up on a farm in Ohio. She had not said what kind of farm or how much she'd actually done on it, and she suspected Silas had read the word farm and made assumptions. The assumptions were not wrong, as it turned out. She could drive a wagon, she could mend a fence post in a basic way, she understood how animals needed to be worked around rather than forced, she could read weather by the way the light changed in the afternoon. What she hadn't expected was that Silas would notice. He wasn't a talkative man. He was the kind of man who communicated more through action than language. He showed you he respected something by doing it alongside you, rather than by saying so. But she caught him watching her sometimes, when she was doing something he hadn't expected her to know how to do, with an expression that was calibrating, reassessing. She didn't perform for it. She just did the work. The things she wasn't good at, she didn't hide. She couldn't shoe a horse and said so plainly. She'd never properly castrated a calf, and she wasn't starting now. She could cook well enough to keep people alive and occasionally do better than that, but she had no pretensions about being any kind of remarkable in a kitchen. "You're going to tell me what you can't do?" Silas said, the day she told him about the horseshoeing. "Seems more efficient than letting you find out the hard way," she said. He almost smiled again. That same barely there movement at the corner of his mouth. They were developing. Not a friendship, exactly. Not yet. But a working relationship that had, underneath it, the suggestion that something more durable might eventually be possible. They didn't crowd each other. They didn't perform closeness. They didn't have. But when she handed him something he needed before he'd asked for it, or when he noticed she was struggling with the weight of the water barrel and came over and took it without comment, there was a kind of steadiness to it. She had been in enough bad situations to recognize a good one in the making. She didn't rush it. June was the harder question. The girl had been watching Evelyn since the first day with those careful dark eyes that were too old for her face. She was 7, but she had the manner of a child who had learned to be very quiet about what she felt, because feeling things out loud had recently become too costly. She helped Evelyn. She showed her where things were, answered questions, carried what she was asked to carry, did her chores without complaint. But she kept a precise distance. Evelyn noticed it and respected it. She didn't push. She didn't try to manufacture warmth or force affection. She just made sure June ate enough and slept enough and had something to do with her hands when the afternoons got long and quiet. She taught her to make biscuits one afternoon when there was nothing more urgent pressing. Not as a lesson, she didn't frame it that way, just stood June beside her at the kitchen counter and talked through what she was doing as she did it, and let June's hands do more and more of the work. June was precise about it. She measured twice. She asked questions. "My mother's biscuits were better," she said midway through. "I expect they were," Evelyn said. "You'll learn hers eventually. Right now you're learning mine." June was quiet for a moment. She didn't write down the recipe. A lot of good cooks don't. "I tried to remember it, but I can't remember how much of things." Evelyn kept working. "What do you remember?" "She always smelled the flour first. She said you could tell if it had gone bad by the smell." "That's true. That's a real thing. Smell yours." June picked up the flour tin and smelled it. She made a face. "It smells like flour." "Good flour. That's what you want." June put the tin down and looked at it. "I was 7 when she died," she said. Not as an accusation. As information she was placing carefully on the counter between them. "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm still 7. "Yes." "So it hasn't been very long." "No," Evelyn said. "It hasn't." June picked up the wooden spoon and began to stir the way Evelyn had shown her, methodically, turning the mixture from the outside in. Her jaw was set in a way that was familiar. Evelyn had seen that jaw on Silas, and she was clearly thinking through something. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. The directness of it hit Evelyn somewhere in the chest. She considered her answer for a real moment, not a quick reassurance moment. "I intend to," she said. "I can't promise you anything beyond that because no one can promise something like that, and it wouldn't be honest to say otherwise. But I intend to stay." June stirred. "What if you don't like it here?" "I like it here." "What if Pa is mean to you?" Evelyn blinked. "Has he been mean to you?" "No, he's just sad. But sad people sometimes get mean." "Sometimes they do," Evelyn agreed. "I've managed mean people before." June looked up at her, assessing. "Okay," she said finally. It wasn't a welcome. It was closer to a provisional suspension of judgment. Evelyn would take it. It was the beginning of December when Wade Creed arrived. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horse in the yard, and she looked out the window and saw a man she didn't recognize dismounting at the post. Tall, like Silas, but broader. He moved with the authority of a man who was used to being the largest presence in any room he entered. Silas came out of the barn when he heard the horse. From the window, Evelyn watched them greet each other. A handshake that became something closer to an embrace, brief, the kind men do when they won't admit they've missed each other. Some back and forth she couldn't hear, Silas glancing toward the house. Then the man looked at the house too. Directly at the window where Evelyn was standing, she didn't step back. She held his gaze for a moment and then went back to what she was doing. He came inside about 20 minutes later. Silas introduced him. "My brother Wade," Silas said. "He runs the other Creed property, up near Sheridan." "Wade Creed," Evelyn said, and offered her hand. Wade Creed shook it. His grip was firm, in the way of a man demonstrating something. His eyes were doing something she'd seen before, that careful, cataloging look that men gave women they'd already decided to distrust. "Miss Hart," he said. She noticed he didn't say Mrs. She noticed it and didn't comment on it. They had supper together. The 5 of them, Wade included, June eyeing her uncle with the particular mix of wariness and affection that children hold for relatives they don't see often. The conversation was mostly Silas and Wade talking about cattle prices and fence repairs and a dispute with a neighboring property that Evelyn didn't know the background of. She listened. She fed Millie. She got June a second portion when the girl finished her first without asking. Wade watched her do all of it. After supper, when the girls were in bed, the three of them sat in the main room with coffee and a fire, and Evelyn could feel the shape of the conversation that was coming. "So," Wade said, addressing his brother and not quite including Evelyn in the address, "this is the arrangement." "It is," Silas said. "You've not been married yet." "Not yet." Wade nodded slowly. His coffee cup moved in his hands. He still wasn't looking at Evelyn, and then he was. "How long have you been here, Miss Hart?" "Nearly 3 weeks," she said. "And before Wyoming?" "Philadelphia." Before Philadelphia? She met his eyes. A number of places? There was a silence that had edges to it. "My brother is not a complicated man," Wade said. "He doesn't need complications." "I'm not sure anyone does," Evelyn said. "You know what I mean." "I think I do," she said, and kept her voice even. "You want to know if I'm trustworthy. That's a reasonable thing to want to know about someone who is living in your brother's house." Wade looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted slightly, not softened, but recalibrated. He hadn't expected her to name it directly. "You're right," he said. "That's what I want to know." "Then you should ask what you actually want to ask," she said. "I'd rather answer a direct question than spend the evening answering around one." Silas, to his credit, didn't intervene. He just sat with his coffee and let it play out. Wade put his cup down on the table. "I know your name," he said. "I've heard it before." The room changed. Evelyn felt it, the particular shift in temperature that happened when something you'd been carrying in your coat pocket suddenly got heavy enough to notice. She had known, when she'd accepted the match with a Wyoming rancher, that Wyoming was far from Philadelphia. She had believed that distance would be enough. But she had also known, underneath that belief, in the quieter, more honest part of herself, that she was taking a risk, that the world was smaller than it looked, especially for women with a certain kind of history. She set her own cup down. "Where did you hear it?" she said. "Sheridan," Wade said. "A man named Holloway. He'd come up from Kansas City. He told a story about a woman named Evelyn Hart, who'd been involved in a scandal back east." He paused. "A serious one." Silas was very still. Evelyn did not look at Silas. She kept her eyes on Wade. "What did this man Holloway say the scandal was?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She had had this conversation before, not this specific conversation, but the shape of it. And the steadiness she felt wasn't courage exactly. It was exhaustion. The exhaustion of having told a true story and not been believed, and then having to tell it again. "He said a woman named Evelyn Hart had been involved with a married man," Wade said. "A man named Beaumont, Arthur Beaumont. He said she'd known he was married and had continued the association regardless. And when it came to light, the wife had pressed charges." "She did press charges," Evelyn said. "I was acquitted." "Acquitted doesn't mean innocent, not always." "No," she agreed. "Not always. But in this case, it does." She looked at him directly, and then she told the story. Not the softened version, not the version where she edited herself into a more sympathetic shape. The actual version. She had met Arthur Beaumont at the boarding house where she was working as a seamstress. He had presented himself as a widower. He had been attentive and consistent, and she had believed him because she had no reason not to. She was 22. She had been lonely. She had made what she now understood was a naive error in judgment. Not a moral failing, but an error. When the truth came out, when his wife, a woman named Deborah Beaumont, had arrived at Evelyn's place of work and made the scene that became the foundation of the town's opinion of her, Evelyn had been as blindsided as anyone. She had not known about Deborah Beaumont. The charges pressed were for something more specific than association. Deborah Beaumont, through her family's lawyers, had accused Evelyn of stealing a ring, a diamond ring. They claimed she had taken it from the Beaumont residence during one of her visits. She had never been inside the Beaumont residence. She had met Arthur Beaumont at the boarding house, at tea rooms, once at a park. She had never taken anything from anyone. The charge had been fabricated. The court had found no evidence. The acquittal had been clean. The town had not cared. She told Wade all of this without flinching and without elaboration, and when she was done, she sat with her hands in her lap and let him decide what to do with it. The Beaumont family, she said, had a great deal of money and a great deal of interest in making sure the story that survived was the one that preserved their reputation. Arthur Beaumont was not held accountable for anything. Deborah Beaumont retained her position in society. And I lost everything I had in Philadelphia, which wasn't much to begin with, because a woman acquitted of a crime is still a woman who was accused. Silence. The fire settled. Somewhere upstairs, Millie stirred and went quiet again. "So you came west," Wade said. "So I came west." He looked at his brother. Silas was looking at Evelyn with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not anger, not betrayal, something more interior than either of those. "You didn't mention this in your letters," Silas said. Quietly. "No," she said. "I didn't. I told myself it was because it wasn't relevant, because it was over, because the court had cleared me. But that wasn't entirely honest. I also didn't mention it because I wanted a chance to be seen as something other than that story before it arrived ahead of me." She let that sit. "That was a choice I made," she said. "I'm not going to pretend it was the righteous one. But I'm also not going to apologize for wanting a fair beginning." Wade stood up. He was a big man, and when he stood in a room, it changed the shape of the room. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark yard for a long moment. His shoulders were carrying something. She could see it in the set of them. "I came here to look after my brother," he said. To the window. "Clara was the best person I knew. What happened to this family this year?" He stopped. He turned around. He looked at Evelyn, and she could see that what he was feeling wasn't simple. It wasn't just protectiveness or suspicion. It was grief wearing protectiveness like a coat. "I need to think about what you've told me," he said. "Take whatever time you need," Evelyn said. "I'm going to tell Silas he should know this. I've just told him myself." Wade blinked. "You heard me," she said. "I am not running from this. I'm done running from it. You can think what you want about what I've told you, but you're not going to have the satisfaction of telling me I need to leave before I've had a chance to prove otherwise." Another silence, longer than the previous ones. Wade looked at his brother. Silas was watching Evelyn with that unreadable expression that had shifted, she thought, into something slightly different. Something that might have been. Not admiration, not yet, but recognition. "I'll take the spare room in the barn," Wade said finally. "If that's all right." "It's your brother's barn," Evelyn said. He left. Silas didn't move for a moment after the door closed. The fire popped. The wind came against the windows. "That man in Sheridan," Silas said. "Holloway. You don't know him?" "No." "So the story is already traveling." "Stories like mine tend to," she said. "I told you. I'm done being surprised by that." He looked at her across the room, and she looked back at him, and she felt the particular vulnerability of having placed a true thing in front of someone and not yet knowing what they would do with it. "I need to think," Silas said. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you for anything tonight. I'm just asking you to think with the whole story, not half of it." He nodded. She picked up her cup and the remaining dishes and went to the kitchen to wash them, because the dishes still needed washing regardless of what had just happened in the other room, and because she needed something to do with her hands. She washed the cups and the plates and the pot from supper, and the water went cold and she kept washing, and when she was done, she dried her hands and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the dark Wyoming night outside. She had not run. For the first time in 4 years, she had stood still and let the story find her and told the truth of it, and not run. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt like being very tired and very awake at the same time. She put the dish towel down on the counter. She went upstairs. She passed Millie's room and stopped and looked through the cracked door at the baby sleeping in her crib, one small fist loosely curled, the way babies slept when they were finally warm and full and safe. She stood there a moment in the dark hallway. Then she went to her room and lay down on the narrow bed and pulled the blanket up and stared at the ceiling of a house she didn't own in a territory she'd never visited before September, and waited to see whether the morning would change anything. Outside the window, the Wyoming stars came through in their thousands, indifferent and enormous, the same stars that had been there before she arrived and would be there long after. Somewhere in the barn, she heard Wade Creed settle his horse. Somewhere downstairs, she heard Silas add wood to the fire. And then the house went quiet around her, and she was still in it, and that was the most she could say for now. That she was still in it, that she hadn't left. Silas didn't say anything about it the next morning. He came in from the early chores, poured his coffee, left the second cup on the counter where she'd find it, and went back outside to start the day. Same as always. Or close enough to same that Evelyn didn't know what to make of it. Wade was at breakfast. He ate without speaking much, which was different from the night before when he'd spoken too much and too pointedly. He played with Millie in a way that was natural and comfortable, bouncing her on his knee, making the kind of sounds grown men make when they're sure no one they need to impress is watching. And that told Evelyn something about him she hadn't seen the night before. Whatever his feelings about her, he loved these children. That was real. June watched her uncle with the careful attention she gave to everything and said, "Are you staying?" "A few days," Wade said. "Because of her?" June nodded toward Evelyn, unapologetic about it. "June," Silas said from across the table. "It's a fair question," Evelyn said. Wade looked at June. "I came to check on your father," he said, "and to check on you and your sister." "We're fine," June said. "She fixed the stove draft. Pa couldn't figure out what was wrong with it for 2 months." Nobody said anything to that. Evelyn poured herself coffee and sat down and ate her breakfast, and the morning went on, which was the only direction mornings knew how to go. Silas came to find her that afternoon. She was in the barn, doing something she'd taken over by default, cleaning out one of the stalls that had been neglected long enough to become a problem. It was not a pleasant job. She'd wrapped an old cloth around her nose and mouth and was working with the shovel in the systematic way her father had taught her, starting at the back wall and moving forward. She heard Silas come in and didn't stop working. He stood at the stall door for a moment. "You don't have to do that." "I know," she said, "but it needed doing." He leaned against the door frame with his arms crossed and watched her work. She could feel him preparing something. "I want to tell you about Clara," he said. She stopped then. She turned around and looked at him. His face was doing that thing it did when he was saying something that cost him, a kind of careful stillness, like a man walking a narrow board and not looking down. "You don't have to," she said. "I know I don't have to." He paused. "I want to. Because of what you told us last night. Because it doesn't seem right that you've laid something down and I've given you nothing back." She pulled the cloth down from her face and waited. He told her about Clara in the way people tell those stories, not in order, not completely, but in the way that memory actually works, in flashes, in textures. Clara had grown up in a family of 7 children in Nebraska. She had a laugh that June had partly inherited. She'd been practical almost to a fault, had no patience for sentiment, but would quietly do kind things when she thought no one was noticing. She had wanted more children after June, but there'd been difficulty, and then Millie had finally come, and the delivery had gone badly in ways the doctor couldn't fully explain, and Clara had spent Millie's first month gradually losing ground, and then she was gone. Millie was 6 weeks old, he said. June understood and didn't understand at the same time. The worst of it was watching June understand more every day. He stopped and looked at the hay on the barn floor. "I'm not a man who knows how to ask for help," he said. "I know that about myself. Clara used to tell me it was going to get me into trouble someday." He almost smiled, not quite. "I suppose she was right." Evelyn leaned the shovel against the wall. "I found the box," she said, "in the hall closet. I wasn't looking for it. I was chasing down an onion situation, but I saw it and I put it back and I didn't tell you because I didn't know how." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara's letters. I figured. I put them there because I couldn't. I kept taking them out, and I couldn't." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I know it makes no sense." "It makes complete sense," she said. "You couldn't throw them away because that would mean something final. And you couldn't look at them because that was something else final. So you put them somewhere you didn't have to make that decision every time you walked down the hall." He looked at her. "I'm not criticizing it," she said. I understand that kind of logic." "It's not very logical. Most of the real ones aren't." They stood in the barn with the smell of hay and animal around them, and the pale winter light coming through the gaps in the boards. And it was not a comfortable moment exactly, but it was an honest one, which was something more durable than comfort. "I heard what you said last night," he said, "about the Beaumont business. All of it." She waited. "I believe you," he said. 2 words. Evelyn had heard a lot of words spoken to her in her 26 years, by a lot of people, in a lot of registers. Those 2 were among the most expensive she'd ever received. She nodded once and didn't say anything, because whatever she might have said would have been insufficient. Wade doesn't know what he thinks yet, Silas said. He'll come around or he won't. That's between him and you. I understand. But I wanted you to know that it doesn't change. He paused, organizing the sentence. It doesn't change what I think about the kind of person you are. What you did for Millie. What you've done for this house. For June. He looked at the stall she'd been cleaning. The things you take on without being asked. You took me in, she said. It seemed like the least I could do. You didn't take me in, he said. You don't owe me anything. The arrangement was supposed to go the other direction. I think arrangements rarely end up going exactly the direction they were supposed to, she said. This time the almost smile made it all the way to something real. Brief. Crooked. It changed his whole face for a second and then was gone, but she'd seen it. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. When you came here, when you were on that stagecoach and the wheel broke and you were stuck in Ridgecroft for 2 days, what did you think about? She considered the honest answer. I thought about whether you'd still want the arrangement when you met me in person, she said. I thought about whether the girls would accept me. I thought about whether I was making a mistake. She paused. And I thought that even if it was a mistake, staying in Philadelphia was a worse one. He nodded slowly. And now? She looked around the barn, at the horses, at the stall she'd been cleaning, at the pale light, at this man she'd known for less than a month who had told her about his dead wife without being asked. Now I think I'd like to get this stall finished before the temperature drops, she said. He picked up a second shovel from the wall without being asked. They finished the stall together. Wade left 3 days later. He said his goodbyes to Silas with that same brief, firm embrace, and to June with something warmer, and he held Millie for a long moment in the yard before handing her back. Then he stopped in front of Evelyn. She waited. I'm not convinced, he said. Not unkindly, just honestly. I'm not asking you to be, she said. I'm telling you I'm watching. I'd expect nothing less. He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded, mounted his horse, and rode north toward Sheridan. Evelyn watched him go and felt the complicated mixture of relief and unresolved business that tended to follow encounters with people who hadn't yet decided about you. June appeared at her elbow. He doesn't like you. He doesn't trust me. That's different. June thought about it. Is it? Yes. Dislike is about who you are. Distrust is about what you've done or what someone's told him about what you've done. One is harder to change than the other. June considered this with the particular seriousness she applied to ideas that interested her. Which one is harder to change? Dislike, Evelyn said. If someone's already decided they don't like you, evidence doesn't help much. But distrust? Distrust can be answered, given enough time and enough truth. How much time? That depends on the person, Evelyn said, and on how much truth you're willing to show them. June went quiet and then said, I trust you. Evelyn looked down at her. I decided, June said, with the precision of someone who understood the weight of what they were committing to. I decided yesterday, when you fixed the stove draft and didn't make a big thing of it. Evelyn felt something move in her chest. Thank you, she said. That means something to me. June nodded, satisfied, and went back inside. Evelyn stood in the yard a moment longer in the cold air, and then followed. December deepened. The cold that came to Wyoming in December was not the cold she had known in Philadelphia or Ohio. It was a different kind of cold, not just temperature but pressure, a cold that had weight to it, that came down from the mountains and sat on the land and didn't apologize. The sky went white before the snow arrived, a particular flat white that drained all the color out of the horizon, and the animals felt it before the people did, and grew restless in ways that demanded attention. Silas watched the sky. He had the habit of all ranchers who've spent enough seasons in a place, that constant peripheral monitoring of conditions, the way his head turned toward the window when the wind changed. Storm coming, he said one morning, the second week of December. How bad? Evelyn asked. He looked at the sky a moment longer than she thought the question required. Don't know yet. Could be passing. Could be something worse. She started laying in what she could. Extra wood on the covered porch. Extra water in the kitchen cistern because the pump froze in serious cold. She checked the medicine shelf. Well, not much there, and she noted the gaps. Extra lamp oil. an additional blanket shaken out from the cedar chest and aired over the porch railing. Silas, for his part, worked the cattle lines, moving the animals closer to the barn, checking the structure of the windbreak fencing on the north side of the property. He came in at meals and ate and went back out, and he looked at the sky every time he stepped outside with an expression that had moved from watchfulness to something closer to calculation. "Should we go to town?" Evelyn asked on the third day, when the sky had gone from white to a particular shade of gray-green that she'd never seen before. "No time," he said. "It's coming tonight." It came that night. She woke at some point in the deep dark. She couldn't have said what time, because the sound of the world had changed. The wind had become something different. It wasn't gusting anymore. It was a sustained, massive force, a sound like the land itself was moving, and with it came the particular rattle and shudder of a structure being hit continuously from the outside. She lay still for a moment and took inventory. House, holding. Fire, alive. She could hear it. Girls, quiet, which meant they were still asleep. She got up and went to check on both of them. June was burrowed deeply under two quilts, only the top of her dark hair visible. Millie was in her crib with the warm brick wrapped in flannel at the foot that Evelyn had put there before bed, and she was sleeping with the absolute unawareness of a baby who doesn't yet know there are things to be afraid of. Evelyn went downstairs and built up the fire. Outside, the storm was doing something she'd never experienced. Not just the sound, but the cold coming through every gap, every seam, every place where the house had a crack or a questionable joint. She could feel it across the room. She fed the fire until it was as large as she safely dared and stood before it with her shawl wrapped around her and listened to Wyoming try to come through the walls. Silas came down an hour later. He'd been up already. She could tell by the fact that he was fully dressed, boots and coat on, and he had the look of a man who'd been lying awake doing arithmetic. "The north barn wall," he said. "I need to check it." "In this?" "If it comes down, I'll lose the horses." She looked at the door. On the other side of it was a sound that was difficult to describe to someone who hadn't heard it. A blizzard of that magnitude had a voice, and it was not a kind one. "Give me an hour," he said. "If I'm not back—" "You'll be back," she said. Not because she knew it, but because the alternative sentence was not one she was prepared to hear finished. He looked at her. "Keep the fires up. Don't let the girls come outside for anything." "I know," she said. He went. She stood at the door for a moment after it closed, listening to the storm swallow him, and then she turned around and went to make coffee because there was nothing else useful she could do, and she needed something to do. He came back in 40 minutes, which was 40 minutes during which Evelyn moved between the kitchen and the front window in a way she wouldn't describe as pacing, but was functionally identical. "The north wall was holding," he said. He'd reinforced a section that had been separating, nailed it with what he had. His hands were white when he came in. She ran warm water into a basin and made him put them in without asking. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands in the basin and his hat still on, and looked like a man absorbing the fact that he'd survived something. "The wall's holding," he said again. "Good," she said. "Drink this." She put coffee in front of him. He drank it. That was the first night. By the second day, the world outside was white in every direction. The snow had drifted against the house in places until it reached the lower windowsills. The path to the barn was a trench that Silas had to recut every few hours because the wind kept filling it back in. The temperature had dropped to something that the thermometer on the porch measured at 17 below zero, which was a number Evelyn understood intellectually, but hadn't previously known in her body. She understood it now. The house held the heat from the two fires well enough. Silas had built it with Wyoming winters in mind. Thick walls, small windows, no wasted space. But the edges of rooms, the places furthest from the fires, were genuinely cold. She moved the girls' sleeping arrangements downstairs, both of them in the sitting room near the main fire, and that arrangement became the center of their storm-bound life. June was stoic about it in a way that was almost comical. She treated the blizzard as a practical problem to be managed, helping Evelyn with the cooking, asking reasonable questions about storm procedure, and only twice going to look out the front window with an expression that suggested she was maybe slightly impressed against her will. Millie did not care about the blizzard at all. She cared about being held and about her next feeding and about the particular rattle toy that June had found in the toy chest and given her, which she addressed with intense and unwavering focus. On the afternoon of the second day, Millie fell asleep in the early evening as the light failed and the storm continued its work outside. She woke at midnight different. Evelyn heard it first. That shift in the crying, from the ordinary demand of a hungry or uncomfortable baby, to the thing she'd heard once before, the thin, wrong quality that meant the body was working too hard on something it shouldn't have to work on. She was up and moving before she was fully awake. Millie was hot. Not warm. Hot. The kind of hot that a baby's skin shouldn't be, that had no business being that extreme, that hit Evelyn's hand like a small coal. "No," she said, out loud, to the room, to nothing in particular, just the word, with everything she felt about this situation compressed into it. She picked Millie up and felt the heat radiating through the blanket. The baby's eyes were open and glassy, focused on nothing. Her breathing was too fast and too shallow. Evelyn's mind did what it had learned to do in emergencies. It split. One part of her was afraid in a way that was real and physical, a cold thing spreading through her chest. The other part was already making a list. Temperature, water, cooling cloth, what medicine was on the shelf, what the doctor had said the last time. The doctor. The doctor was 20 miles away, in a blizzard. Silas appeared in the doorway. He'd heard Millie from the next room, where he'd been sleeping, and the expression on his face when he saw the baby in Evelyn's arms was the expression of a man who recognized this particular disaster. "How bad?" he said. "Bad," Evelyn said. He put his hand to Millie's forehead and something went through him. Not panic, but the physiological equivalent of a door slamming shut. She saw it happen. "The doctor," he said. "Silas." "I know what's outside," he said. He said it like a man arguing with himself. "I know, but she needs—" "Let me try first," Evelyn said. "Give me 2 hours. Let me work with her for 2 hours and see if we can bring this down before you go anywhere. If I wait 2 hours and then have to go, I'll be writing in the dark." "You're already in the dark." She looked at him directly. 2 hours. If it's not coming down in 2 hours, I won't try to stop you." He looked at Millie, at Evelyn, at Millie again. 2 hours, he said. She went to work. She'd done this before 25 days ago, and she reached back into that memory and pulled everything useful from it. The sequence mattered. Keep the child calm, because distress raised body temperature. Cool the extremities first. Wrists, ankles, the back of the neck. Before the forehead. Keep the cloth cool, but not cold, because cold caused its own kind of shock. Keep the child upright rather than lying flat when the breathing was rapid. She sat in the chair by the fire with Millie propped against her chest and worked the cloths in a steady rotation, and she talked to the baby in a low, continuous murmur. Not words exactly, or not words that mattered as language, just the sound of a human voice being calm near an infant who needed something nearby to be calm. Silas sat on the footstool and watched. She could feel the effort it cost him not to pace. At one point he said, "She looks worse." "She doesn't look worse," Evelyn said, without looking up. "She looks the same. Looking the same at 20 minutes is different from looking worse." "How can you tell?" "Her breathing hasn't changed. Fever this high. If it's getting worse, the breathing changes first." He was quiet. Another 20 minutes passed. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. "My brother Thomas," she said. "He got fevers easy as a child. My mother worked evenings. I was the one home with him." She replaced the cloth on Millie's neck. "I was terrified the first 3 or 4 times. Then I got less terrified and more practical." "Terrified doesn't seem like you." She looked up at him. "I'm terrified right now," she said. "I'm just not letting it run the room." He looked at her with something that was not quite what it would become, but was moving in that direction. She could see it happening in him, and didn't comment on it, just went back to Millie and the cloth and the counting she was doing in her head. An hour in, something shifted. It was subtle, a degree of change in the skin temperature under her hand, a fractional slowing of the baby's breathing, the particular way Millie's eyes went from that glassy, unfocused state to something slightly more present. "It's moving," Evelyn said. Silas leaned forward. "Down?" "Down," she said. "Slowly, but yes." She heard him exhale. It was not a quiet exhale. They stayed as they were, Evelyn in the chair with the baby, Silas on the footstool, While the storm continued outside and the fire worked and Millie's temperature moved in the right direction in the incremental, unspectacular way that these things happened when they went well. At the 2-hour mark, Millie was still hot, but measurably less so, and her breathing had settled, and she had closed her eyes and gone into a more genuine sleep. "She's not out of it," Evelyn said quietly. "This could spike again. It may spike again. But you think she'll be all right?" She didn't answer immediately. "I think she's holding," she said finally. "I think we watch her through the night and we see what morning brings." He nodded. "Don't go," she said. It wasn't a plea, it was a statement. She said it the same way she'd said everything else tonight, directly, without decoration. "Not tonight," he agreed. He got up and went to the kitchen and came back with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. She took it one-handed, the other hand still on Millie, and drank it carefully. They sat like that through the rest of the night, taking turns, one sleeping in the chair while the other watched, switching every hour or so, neither of them acknowledging the informality of what they'd settled into. When you were both watching a sick child through a blizzard, the usual architecture of how 2 people who were still almost strangers were supposed to occupy a room became irrelevant. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, June appeared in the doorway in her nightgown. "Is she getting worse again?" June asked. "No," Evelyn said. "She's holding." June looked at her sister for a moment, then at her father, then at Evelyn. "I can sit with her," June said, "if you need to sleep." Evelyn looked at this 7-year-old standing in the doorway offering to take a watch shift. "Come sit with me," she said. "You don't have to take over. Just sit." June came and sat on the footstool her father had vacated, and she sat very straight and very quiet and watched her sister breathe. After a while she said, "Is this what it was like before? When Millie was sick at the beginning?" "Similar," Evelyn said. "I was really scared that time," June said. "I didn't know what to do. I just stood in the room." "You did the right thing. You stayed with her." "I didn't do anything." "Staying is doing something," Evelyn said. "It's not nothing, June. Being there isn't nothing." June was quiet. Then, "Is that why you stayed? When Pa wasn't coming in from the barn? You could have left." Evelyn looked at the baby in her arms, at the fire, at the window behind which the blizzard was doing what blizzards did. "I couldn't have left," she said. "I heard her crying." "But you didn't know us." "No," she said. "I didn't. So why—" "Because some things you do before you have a reason," Evelyn said, "and then afterward you figure out what the reason was." June considered this for so long that Evelyn thought she might have fallen asleep sitting up. Then she said, "I'm glad you didn't leave." "Me too," Evelyn said. Shut. Dawn came slowly, the way dawn comes after a bad night. Not triumphantly, not cleanly, but as a gradual lightening of what had been completely dark. The world going from black to gray to a white. That was the snow reflecting a sky that still couldn't decide. The storm was not over, but it had eased. The sustained howl had dropped to an irregular wind, gusting rather than constant. The temperature had risen, not by much, but enough that the thermometer read 12 below instead of 17. Millie's fever had broken somewhere in the pre-dawn hours. Evelyn knew it before she checked, felt it in the baby's weight, the way a feverish child holds their body differently than a child at rest. She put her hand to Millie's forehead and found it cool and damp with the particular sweat of a fever that is finished. She sat back in the chair and closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, Silas was awake in the other chair, watching her. "Done?" he said. "I think so," she said. "I think we're through it." He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands for a moment. Not crying, just somewhere. She didn't disturb it. When he came back up, his face had the look of a man who had done a lot of internal accounting very quickly. He looked at Evelyn across the room. This woman who had arrived in his yard a month ago with a single trunk and $30-some and a history he'd just learned about, and an ability to keep a fevered baby alive through a blizzard that he was still processing. "I need to say something," he said. "All right." "When you first came," he said, "I was—" He stopped. Started again. "I was not in any condition to be taking on something new. I know that. I was barely managing what was already here. I sent for you because I knew the girls needed someone and I couldn't. I couldn't do all of it. But I also wasn't ready." She waited. "I'm not saying I'm ready now," he said. I'm not standing here telling you I have everything figured out. I don't. But I want you to know that what you've done here, what you're still doing, I see it. It's not disappearing into the house and being taken for granted. I see it. Evelyn looked at him steadily. Thank you, she said. You don't have to thank me for seeing something that's actually there. I've been in situations where people looked directly at something true and decided they were looking at something else, she said. So yes, I do have to thank you, because it isn't nothing. He held her gaze. Outside, the wind came and went. The fire settled. Millie slept. You stay, he said. It was the same thing he'd said once before that first night, offering her the spare room. But it didn't mean the same thing now, and they both knew it. It had more weight to it, more intention, more of whatever was being built between two people who had survived something together and were beginning to understand that the surviving had changed the nature of things. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He nodded once, like a decision being confirmed. Then he stood up and said he was going to go check on the cattle, because the cattle still needed checking regardless of what had just happened in the sitting room, and that was ranching, and she knew that already. She watched him put on his coat and his hat and go to the door, and before he went out he stopped and looked back at her. I'll make sure the path to the barn is clear enough for the day, he said, in case you need to get out there. I won't need to get out there, she said. I'll have enough to do in here. I know, he said, but I'll clear it anyway. He went out. The door closed behind him, and Evelyn sat in the quiet of the warm room with the sleeping baby and the dying fire that needed building up again, and she listened to the wind and the distant sound of Silas moving through the snow in the yard, and she thought that there were worse things than being in a house that was holding against a storm. There were far worse things than this. She shifted Millie to her left arm and used her right hand to reach forward and put another piece of wood on the fire, carefully, so as not to wake the baby, and the wood caught, and the fire rose, and the room was warm again, and outside the Wyoming blizzard kept blowing, but the house kept standing. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The storm broke on the fourth day. Not all at once. Wyoming weather didn't work that way, didn't clean up after itself with any kind of consideration. It retreated in stages, the wind dropping first, then the snow thinning from a wall to a curtain to occasional scatter of flakes that came sideways and then stopped. The sky stayed white for another full day after the snow quit, a flat, blinding white that made the world look like it hadn't decided what it was going to be next. Silas went out the morning of the fifth day and came back with the news that the road toward Harlow was passable. Barely, and only on horseback, not by wagon, but passable. He said it standing in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on and snow melting off his hat brim, and Evelyn heard what he was actually saying underneath the information. That he'd been waiting to know this, that the knowing mattered to him for reasons that had to do with the previous 4 days and what had almost happened in them. I want to get the doctor out here, he said, to look at Millie. Make sure we didn't miss anything. That's a good idea, Evelyn said. I'll go today. I should be back before dark with him. The road? I know the road. He said it without impatience, just as a fact about himself. I know every drop and drift between here and town. I'll be careful. She looked at him. He looked back. There was a conversation happening underneath this one, as there often was between them now. A second layer that they both heard, and neither of them fully addressed, because they were still learning the vocabulary for it. All right, she said. He left mid-morning, and the day organized itself around his absence the way days did when someone who'd become central to the shape of things wasn't there. June felt it. She was quieter than usual, kept going to the front window without explaining why. Millie, who had eaten well for 2 days and showed no signs of the fever returning, was cheerful in the uncomplicated way of babies who had no memory of having been ill. Evelyn worked. She always worked when she was managing worry. She cleaned the sitting room thoroughly, dragging the furniture out and sweeping underneath, beating the rugs against the porch railing in the cold air, refolding the quilts that had been used through the storm. She made soup from the last of the root vegetables and a ham bone she'd been saving, and it was better than she expected, and she let June taste it while it was still cooking. It needs salt, June said. It needs more than salt. What else? June thought. Something sharp, like the pickled stuff you made last week. Vinegar, yes, good catch. She added a splash. Try it now. June tried it. Better. You have a good palate. June looked pleased in the careful way she allowed herself to look pleased. What's a palate? Your sense of taste. Some people are born with a sharp one. They notice more than other people do. It's useful. Can you learn it, or are you born with it? Mostly born with it, but you can develop it. Stir. Tell me what you think it needs after 5 more minutes. June stirred with the focused attention she brought to everything that interested her, and Evelyn let her, and they worked together in the kitchen while Millie played on the floor with the rattle and the afternoon light came through the window at its low winter angle and lay across the floorboards in pale rectangles. At some point, June said, without looking up from the soup, "Pa's going to be all right, isn't he?" "Yes," Evelyn said, not as reassurance, as information. "You don't know that," June said. Same thing her father had said to her once, weeks ago, in the baby's room. "The road is passable," Evelyn said. "He knows it well. He left in good light. He'll be back before dark." She paused. "I don't know anything for certain, but I think it's likely he'll be fine." June stirred. "That's more honest." "I try to be honest with you." "Most adults don't do that. They say things are going to be fine even when they don't know." "That comes from wanting to protect you," Evelyn said. "It's not dishonest on purpose. It's just, people don't want to hand a child a fear they might not need to carry." "But then when things go wrong, you're not prepared," June said. Evelyn looked at her. "How old are you?" 7.5. "Right," Evelyn said. "Of course. What?" Silas came back at 4 in the afternoon with the doctor, a man named Horace Gell, who was older than Evelyn had expected and moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had made this kind of call in this kind of weather more times than he cared to count. He examined Millie with the thorough, unhurried thoroughness of a man who didn't perform doctoring for an audience, and when he was done, he sat back and gave his opinion plainly. The baby had fought off a respiratory fever, probably viral in origin, and appeared to have come through it without lasting damage to the lungs, which was the concern with infants that young. She should be watched for the next week. Any return of symptoms, he wanted to know. Otherwise, she had the constitution of a small, determined animal, and he meant that as a compliment. "Who managed her through the worst of it?" he asked. "Evelyn," Silas said. Dr. Gell looked at her. The cool compresses, the upright positioning, the slow temperature reduction rather than trying to break it quickly. "Yes," she said. "That was right," he said. "If you'd tried to break it fast, you could have sent her into shock. Slow reduction is the safe way with a baby this small." He paused. "You knew that already, or you figured it out?" "I remembered it from my brother," she said. "I wasn't certain I was doing it correctly." "You were." He closed his bag. "I've seen mothers with 5 children not know that." He stayed for soup, which June served with a seriousness that bordered on ceremony, and he and Silas talked about the storm damage around the county. 2 families had lost roof sections. One man had lost all his winter cattle feed when a barn wall collapsed. The Hennessy place 6 miles south had flooded when a drainage ditch backed up under the snow. And Evelyn listened to all of it and felt the particular weight of knowing they had come through relatively intact. Not undamaged, but intact. After the doctor left, Silas came back into the kitchen where Evelyn was washing the soup bowls and stood at the table and said, "He said you did it right." "I heard him," she said. "I wanted to make sure you heard it." She looked at him over her shoulder. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim in a way she'd noticed he did when he had something to say that he hadn't fully found the words for. "Silas," she said, "say the thing you're trying to say." He stopped turning the hat. "When I rode to get the doctor, I know you told me to wait. I know you said 2 hours. But I was thinking about it before you said it, and I think I had already decided that if it got worse, I was going to go regardless of what you said." She turned back to the dishes. "I know." "You knew?" "You're her father," she said. "Of course you knew." He put the hat on the table. "If I'd gone during the worst of it, you might not have made it," she said. Not cruelly, just accurately. "The road was different yesterday than it was today. You know that." He was quiet. "You stayed because it was the right call," she said. "Not because I asked you to. Because you looked at the situation and made the right calculation. Give yourself credit for that." "I was terrified the whole night," he said. "I told you, terrified doesn't mean incapable." She finished the last bowl and dried her hands and turned around. He was looking at her with that expression she'd been watching develop over 2 months, the one that wasn't grief, or not only grief, that was beginning to have something else in it, something that existed alongside the grief without replacing it. You did fine, Silas. We did fine, he said. Yes, she agreed. We did. Wade arrived 9 days after the storm broke. He came on a Thursday, mid-afternoon, riding a horse that looked like it had covered ground quickly. He didn't send word ahead. He just appeared in the yard, which was his way, apparently. Silas had mentioned that Wade operated on the principle that arrival was announcement enough. Evelyn was on the porch, working a section of broken railing back into serviceable shape with a hammer and 3 nails that she'd found in the barn. She was not skilled at this. She knew it. But the railing had been broken since she'd arrived and no one else had gotten to it, and she was tired of the lopsided thing catching her coat sleeve every time she went past it. She was on her 3rd attempt at the angle when she heard the horse. She looked up and saw Wade Creed coming across the yard, and she sat back on her heels and waited. He dismounted. He tied his horse. He came to the porch steps and stopped, looking at what she was doing. "You're going to split that board if you come in at that angle," he said. "I've noticed that," she said. "I haven't figured out the solution yet." He stood there for a moment. Then he climbed the porch steps, took off his coat, laid it over the railing, and held out his hand for the hammer. She looked at him. "The nail needs to go in from the side, not the top," he said. "The top doesn't give you enough purchase on the post." She handed him the hammer. He knelt beside her, pulled the badly placed nail, repositioned it, and drove it in at the angle he described with 3 strikes that were economical and accurate. He did the second nail the same way. When he was done, the railing section sat flush and solid, and he pressed on it with his palm to test it, and it didn't move. He handed the hammer back. "Thank you," she said. "Where's Silas?" "Back pasture. He said he'd be in by 3. Wade nodded. He picked up his coat and didn't put it on, just held it, and stood on the fixed porch and looked out at the ranch. "I heard about the storm," he said. "It was a bad one." "I heard Millie was sick again." "She was." He turned and looked at her. "I heard what you did." She waited. "Hank at the livery told me," he said. "He heard from the doctor. Gel talks, apparently, which I suppose you'd want your doctor to do, so people know to come to him." He paused. He told Hank that the woman out at the Creed Ranch had managed a serious infant fever through a blizzard and done it correctly, and that the baby was fine. Evelyn didn't say anything. Wade looked at the yard again. His jaw was working slightly, the way it did, she was learning, when he was composing something internally. "I came to my brother's house 2 weeks ago," he said, "ready to dislike you." "I know," she said. "I'm a man who's used to being right about people," he said. "It doesn't sit well with me when I'm not." "I'd imagine not." He looked at her. "I'm not a man who apologizes easily either." "Wade," she said, "whatever you've got, just say it. We're past careful." Something moved across his face, something that might have been the beginning of respect, or at least the shape of where respect was going to be once he let it land. "I was wrong about you," he said. "The way I came at you, the things I implied. That was wrong of me, and I'm saying so directly." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "That's it? What else would you like?" He blinked. "Most people say more." "I've spent 4 years waiting for people to acknowledge something true," she said. "I don't need a speech about it. I just needed the acknowledgement." She stood up from where she'd been crouching, brushed the dust from her skirt. "I accept it. Thank you." He looked slightly wrong-footed by the efficiency of it. She had the sense that he'd prepared a longer version of this scene in his head, and she'd just bypassed most of it, and he wasn't sure whether that made it better or worse. "There's coffee inside," she said. "Silas won't be long." She went in and left him standing on the porch. The 3 of them sat at the kitchen table that evening, after the girls were in bed, with coffee and the remains of a dried apple cake that Evelyn had made that afternoon. The kitchen was warm. The storm damage was visible from the window. The fence line that had taken a section down. The barn wall Silas had reinforced with mismatched boards, but visible in the way that damage was visible after it had been assessed and survived, not in the way it was visible during. Wade had been different all evening, not soft, that wasn't the word for it, more settled, less like a man deciding whether to trust something and more like a man who had made that decision and was figuring out what to do with it. He waited until June was definitely asleep, and then he said, "I need to tell you something about the Beaumont business." The name landed on the table between them like a piece of metal. Evelyn set her cup down. "After I heard your story," Wade said, I kept thinking there was something I half remembered about that family, the Beaumonts." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. "I wrote to a man I know in Kansas City. He does legal work, some investigations on the side. I asked him to look into it." Silas was very still. Evelyn looked at the paper but didn't reach for it. "What did he find?" Wade unfolded it. The Beaumont family, Arthur Beaumont specifically, had a pattern. You weren't the first woman he'd done this to. There was a woman in Baltimore before you, a woman in Cincinnati before that. He looked at the paper. Both times, when the association came to light, the wife, or in the Cincinnati case, the wife's family, used legal pressure to redirect attention to the woman rather than to Arthur Beaumont. Both times, the woman was accused of something minor but damaging. Both times, the charges didn't stick in court. Both times, it didn't matter, because the social damage was already done. The kitchen was very quiet. "The ring they said I stole," Evelyn said, "never reported missing by anyone except through the legal action against you," Wade said. "My contact found no insurance claim, no other police report. The accusation was constructed specifically for the purpose of the case against you." She had known this. She had known it the way you know something that no one else believes. Carrying it alone for so long that it starts to feel less like knowledge and more like an argument you've lost the energy to make. Hearing it from the outside was different. She put her hand flat on the table. "They made it up," Silas said. Not a question. "They made it up," Wade confirmed. "Used their lawyers, their connections in the city, their capacity to move the story however they needed it to move." And then Arthur Beaumont went on to a third situation. Different city, same pattern, until his wife finally left him 2 years ago, according to public record. Silas was looking at Evelyn. She felt it, but didn't look back at him yet. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked Wade. "Because you deserve to know it from someone else," he said. "Not just from yourself. You've been carrying a true thing alone for 4 years, and it should have been said out loud by somebody who went and found the evidence." She looked at him then. He was serious. Not performing seriousness, not doing this for any reason she could detect other than the one he'd stated. He was a man who had been wrong and had gone and done something about being wrong, and that was not a common thing. "What your contact found," she said carefully, "is any of it documented?" "He sent copies of the court records from Baltimore and Cincinnati," Wade said, "and an affidavit from a clerk at the Philadelphia courthouse who confirmed that no insurance or theft report regarding the ring was ever filed prior to the legal action against you." He pushed the paper across the table. "It's not nothing. If you ever needed to contest the record or clear your name formally, you'd have somewhere to start." She picked up the paper. She looked at it. Her name was not in it. It was a summary of findings, not a transcript, but the shape of the story was there. The pattern, the Beaumont method, laid out by someone who had looked at it from the outside and identified it as a method. She folded it along the existing creases and held it in both hands. "Thank you," she said. She said it to the table, not to Wade, because she needed a moment before she could say it to his face. Then she got herself together and looked up at him. "Genuinely. Thank you." Wade nodded. He picked up his coffee cup and drank from it in a way that closed the ceremony of the moment without making it smaller. Silas reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the one still holding the paper. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She looked down at his hand over hers, at the paper underneath, at the table that had become over 2 months of meals, a place she associated with the ordinary structure of days rather than with any single moment. She let herself feel it, briefly, without managing it. The vindication, the grief of it coming too late for any of the things it might have changed, and underneath both of those, something cleaner and more forward-facing that she didn't have a name for yet. Then she put the paper in her pocket, and she picked up her coffee, and the evening continued. The days after had a different quality. Not easier, exactly. A ranch in winter didn't get easier, it just got different in its demands. But something had shifted in the way the 4 of them, 5, counting Millie, who counted more every day, moved around each other. Wade stayed a week. In that week, he was nothing like the man who had arrived the first time. He worked alongside Silas without the air of assessor he'd carried before. He ate at the table and talked to June about her questions. June had many questions, most of them about things outside the ranch, about how other places worked, about what Sheridan was like, about whether Wade had ever seen the ocean, with a patience and genuine engagement that Evelyn hadn't expected from him. He helped Evelyn with the fence section that had gone down in the storm, working it properly with the right tools and the right post depth, talking her through what he was doing rather than just doing it, which she appreciated. "You're teaching me," she said at one point. "You'll need to know it," he said. "Silas can't always get to everything." "I'm aware of that." "I know you are." He drove a post stake and tested it. "I watched you work when I first came. You don't pretend to know things you don't know." "That's generally efficient." "It's also not common," he said. "Most people pretend. Less embarrassment in the short run. More problems in the long run," she said. He made a sound that might have been agreement. They worked in silence for a while, and then he said without looking up, "My brother hasn't been himself since Clara died. You probably figured that." "I did." "He's more himself now than he's been in a year," Wade said. He said it the way he said everything, directly, without ornament, placing information where it needed to go. "I'm not saying it's because of you entirely. I'm saying I notice it." Evelyn kept working. "He's a good man." "He is. He's a better father than he thinks he is." A pause. "He was good with Clara, too. They weren't a perfect couple, nobody is. But they were solid, honest with each other. I always respected that about them." She heard what he was doing, not warning her, not comparing her, but giving her context, handing her something about Silas that Silas himself would probably not think to say. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you don't have anyone else to tell you," he said. "He doesn't have a mother who can pull you aside and do it. You're coming into this family without the scaffolding that usually goes around these things." He straightened up and looked at her. "I'm not good at this kind of conversation, but someone should have it with you." She looked at this large, blunt, difficult man who had come to her brother's house ready to throw her out, and had instead gone and found legal evidence to confirm her story. "I'm not trying to replace Clara," she said. "I know that. And I'm not—" She stopped. "Whatever this is becoming between Silas and me, I'm not rushing it. I don't think either of us is." "I can see that," he said. "It's one of the things Yes, I can see that." She picked up her end of the new fence rail. "Help me with this." He helped her. On the last morning before Wade left, Silas came in from the early chores to find both Wade and Evelyn already in the kitchen, Wade at the table and Evelyn at the stove, and June sitting between them describing in detailed and only partially accurate terms the plot of a story she'd read in one of her school books, gesturing with her spoon for emphasis. Silas stood in the doorway and took in the scene. None of them noticed him for a moment. Wade was listening to June with his elbows on the table, asking a clarifying question when she got to a part that seemed structurally improbable. Evelyn was moving between the stove and the counter in the easy way of someone who knew the kitchen well enough not to think about it. Millie was on the floor nearby, reaching for the sunlight in the way babies reached for things. Not because they expected to get it, but because the impulse was there. Silas looked at all of it and felt something complicated and not entirely nameable move through him. He missed Clara. He would always miss Clara. That was a fixed point, and he'd stopped trying to argue with it. But what he was looking at right now was not less than anything. It was not a replacement or a consolation or a lesser version of something that used to be better. It was a thing that was building itself out of what had survived and what had arrived and what had been found in the middle of a Wyoming winter, and it was its own thing. And he thought Clara, who had been practical almost to a fault, would have been able to see that clearly even if he sometimes struggled to. He stepped into the kitchen. June immediately began the story again from the structural weak point because her audience had doubled. He sat down and listened. Wade said goodbye that afternoon in the yard. To Silas, the usual, handshake, brief embrace. To June, a longer goodbye with a promise to write, which June accepted with conditions about the frequency and content of the letters. To Millie, the holding and the looking that he always did, as if memorizing her. To Evelyn, he said, "I'll come back in the spring, if that's all right." "Of course it's all right," she said. "This is your brother's ranch." "I'm asking if it's all right with you specifically." She held his gaze. "Yes, Wade. It's all right with me." He nodded. Something in his face, Not soft, still the face of a man constitutionally resistant to softness, but settled. He mounted his horse. He rode out of the yard and onto the road north, and he didn't look back, which was also, she was learning, his way. Silas stood beside her, watching him go. "He's not easy," Silas said. "No," she agreed. "Neither am I." "I know," he said. After a moment, she said, "He went looking for the evidence about the Beaumont case. He told me." She looked sideways at him. "He told you before he told me?" "He asked me first if it was all right to look," Silas said. "I told him yes, that it was your business, but yes." She thought about that for a moment. "You could have told me he was looking," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "I thought about it, but I didn't want to. If he found nothing, or if it went sideways somehow, I didn't want you carrying the expectation. You were protecting me from the possibility of disappointment." "Badly," he said. "I know. It wasn't my decision to make." "No," she said. "It wasn't." She paused. "But I understand why you made it." He looked at her. "I'm not forgiving it," she said. "I'm saying I understand it. That's different." "What's the difference?" "Forgiving means it didn't matter," she said. "Understanding means it did, and I'm deciding it doesn't change anything important." He thought about it. "That's harder than forgiving." "Yes," she said. "It is." A long pause. The road was empty where Wade had been. The Wyoming horizon did what it always did. Sat there, enormous, giving nothing away. "Evelyn," Silas said. She waited. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, not kindly," he said. "There's a difference." "I know there's a difference," she said. "When you came here," he said, "when you got off that wagon and walked into the house and heard Millie crying, if you had known what you were walking into, the whole of it, the grief, the chaos, the storm, the fever, my brother showing up and questioning your character, if you had known all of it, would you have walked through that door?" She thought about it honestly, the way he'd asked. She thought about the stage outside and Hank and his $2.50 and the woman at the general store who'd called her Mrs. Creed before she had any claim to the name. She thought about $31 and a piece of paper with an address on it. She thought about Philadelphia and the Beaumont name following her across territories like a smell she couldn't wash off. And she thought about what she'd found when she'd walked through that door. Not what she'd expected, not what she'd bargained for, but what was actually there. A baby who needed someone to pick her up. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he said. She looked at the ranch, the barn, the fence they'd repaired, the porch with its fixed railing, the kitchen window where the light was already on because June had gone inside and turned it on without being asked. "Because I'd been running for 4 years," she said, "and I was tired, and something told me this was the place where running wasn't going to be possible anyway. Too much to do." He made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not one. "That's not exactly a romantic reason." "No," she said. "It's a true one." He looked at her. She looked back. "I'm going to ask you to stay," he said. "Not for a season. Not until the arrangement is settled. I'm going to ask you to stay here and I'm going to ask you to stay as a permanent part of this ranch." She felt the weight of the sentence. "You're asking or you're telling?" "I'm asking," he said firmly. "I'm aware there's a difference." She turned to fully face him in the cold yard with the empty road behind them and the lit kitchen window ahead, and the wind doing its quiet work across the brown winter grass. "What does that look like exactly?" she said. "Staying permanently?" "It looks like a marriage," he said. "When you're ready. When I'm ready. I'm not putting a date to it. I want you to know that's the direction I'm asking toward." She looked at him for a long moment. "I have no money," she said. "I have $31 that I never spent because you housed and fed me before I had a chance to. I have no family of influence, no connections, no land of my own, and a documented scandal in my history that certain people in this territory are already aware of." "I know all of that," he said. "I'm telling you again," she said. "So there's no space for you to feel surprised about it later." "There's no space," he said. "I know who you are. I've been watching you for 2 months. I know." She breathed in the cold air. "All right," she said. "All right, you'll stay?" "All right, I'll stay." She paused. And all right to the direction you're asking toward. He didn't reach for her. He just stood there in the yard with his hands at his sides and looked at her with that look she'd been watching develop. The one that had started as assessment and had become, over 2 months and a fever and a blizzard and a box in a hall closet and a sheet of legal findings from Kansas City, something that had both more grief and more life in it than assessment. Good, he said. Good, she agreed. They went inside because it was cold and dinner needed starting, and June had been alone in the kitchen long enough that she'd probably already begun making improvements to the recipe. She had. She'd added something to the stew that turned out to be dried thyme from the back of the spice shelf, and it was better for it, and she said so without being asked, and Evelyn said she was right without making a production of it, and Silas sat down at the table and watched his daughter and this woman standing side by side at the kitchen stove, and he thought that the house had a sound to it that it hadn't had in over a year. Not the sound of happiness, exactly. Not as simple as that. The sound of a household that was working again. People occupying their roles not because they had to, but because they decided to. It was not a perfect sound. There were rough edges in it, and silences that still had weight, and a box of letters in the hall closet that hadn't been opened yet, and a reputation in a faraway city that hadn't been fully dismantled. But it was real. It was the most real thing Silas had sat inside in over a year. Outside, the last light went off the snow, and the Wyoming sky went its deep winter blue, and inside the kitchen on the Black Ridge Ranch, the stove held its heat, and the lamp was on, and the sound of the household went on, steady and imperfect and very much alive. Winter released its grip on Wyoming the way it always did. Reluctantly, in stages, with occasional reversals that reminded you it hadn't fully made up its mind yet. March came with a week of false warmth that melted the top layer of snow and turned the yard into something that sucked at your boots. And then a hard frost came back and froze everything in place, and the yard became a map of footprints preserved in ice, hers, Silas's, June's smaller ones, the dog's, the record of a household in motion. Then April arrived and meant it, and the melt was real this time, and the mud that followed was the productive, generative kind of mud that meant the ground was waking up. Evelyn stood on the back porch on the first morning that felt genuinely warm and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Not happiness, exactly. Not yet. Something quieter. A kind of permission, like a door opening that she hadn't known was closed. She had been at Black Ridge Ranch for 5 months. 5 months was both longer and shorter than it felt. Longer because of everything that had happened in it, the fevers, the blizzard, Wade's arrival, the document from Kansas City, the conversation in the yard where Silas had asked her to stay in the direction of permanence. Shorter because she still sometimes woke in the morning with the disorientation of a person who had moved too many times, the half second of not knowing where she was, and then the room would come into focus and she would know. And the knowing would settle into her like something warm. She was still here. The fact of it still surprised her sometimes. Silas came around the side of the house with a length of fence wire over his shoulder and saw her standing on the porch and stopped. "You're just standing there," he said. "I'm enjoying the temperature," she said. He looked at the sky, which was doing something with light that Wyoming did in early spring, a particular clarity, as if the air had been washed. "It'll be back below freezing by tonight." "I know," she said. "I'm enjoying it while it lasts." He stood there a moment, then he said, "The south paddock gate is binding again. I'm going to pull the whole post and reset it. Do you want help?" "Not with that. But there's a section of the kitchen garden that needs turning over if you want to start thinking about planting." She looked at the kitchen garden, the dead stalks that had been there when she arrived, which she'd cleared in November, which had sat as bare ground through the winter and were now beginning to show the particular dark richness of soil that had rested. "I'll do it this afternoon," she said. He nodded and went on with his fence wire, and she went in to start the day. June had developed, over the winter, a habit of reading at the kitchen table while Evelyn worked, which had started as proximity. The kitchen was warm, and June liked being near activity even when she wasn't participating in it, and had become something more specific. She would read and occasionally read something aloud, not as a request for conversation, but as a sharing, the way you show someone a thing you find interesting without necessarily needing to discuss it. Evelyn had learned to respond to the right things and let the others go. On a Tuesday in early April, June looked up from a school book and said, "It says here that women can't hold property in Wyoming without a husband's co-signature." "That law changed," Evelyn said. "Wyoming was actually the first territory to give women full property rights. 1869. June looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I read it. Before I came west, I did some reading about the territories. I wanted to know what kind of place I was going to." "Why does it matter? Property rights." Evelyn thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest without being bitter, because the honest answer had some bitterness in it, and she tried not to hand June bitterness when information would do. "Because if you can't own anything in your own name," she said, "you can't make decisions independently. You're always one person's permission away from your own life. It matters." June processed this. "Is that why you came as a mail-order bride? Because you didn't have property in Philadelphia?" "Partly," Evelyn said. "It was more complicated than that. But yes, partly. If you marry Pa, you'll have this ranch together." "That's how it would work. Do you want that? The ranch?" Evelyn looked out the window at the south paddock where she could see Silas working the fence post, the effort of it visible from here. "I want to have built something," she said, "whether it's this ranch or something else. I want to be able to look at a thing and say, I had a hand in making it what it is." She turned back to June. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," June said, with the simplicity of a child who understood something before she had the full language for it. "I want that too." She looked back at her book. "I want to be a doctor." This was not new information. She'd mentioned it once before, in passing, in the fall. But this was the first time she'd said it as a statement of intention rather than a dream. "Then you should be one," Evelyn said. "Pa says it's not practical." "What does he mean by practical?" "Money, distance. He says the medical schools that take women are far away and expensive." "Some of them," Evelyn agreed. "Not all. And far away and expensive is a problem to solve, not a wall." She paused. "Does he say it's not practical because he doesn't believe you can do it, or because he's worried about the logistics?" June thought about this carefully. "The second one, I think." "Then tell him you want to talk about the logistics, not whether you should do it, how to do it." June looked up. "Will you be there when I talk to him about it?" "If you want me to be." "I want you to be," June said, with the directness that was her inheritance from both sides of her family. "All right," Evelyn said. "Then I will be." The conversation happened on a Saturday evening, unexpectedly, because that was how important conversations seemed to happen in this house. Not planned and formal, but sliding in through an opening in an ordinary moment. They were at supper. June put down her fork at a point in the meal where there was a natural pause and said, "I want to talk about me becoming a doctor." Silas looked up. "Evelyn said the way to do it is to talk about logistics," June said, "not whether I should, how I should." Silas looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked back at him with an expression that said, clearly and without apology, "I have no regrets about this." He looked at June. "How old are you?" "You?" 7 3/4. "You want to start planning your medical career at 7 3/4. Evelyn said far away and expensive is a problem to solve, not a wall," June said. Silas was quiet for a moment. Millie, who was in her high chair and had no investment in this conversation, was working on a piece of boiled potato with the focused determination that characterized all her current activities. "The women's medical schools," Silas said slowly. "They're in Philadelphia mainly. Boston. There are 2 in the Midwest now," Evelyn said. "One in Chicago, one in Cincinnati. They're newer, so the fees are lower." Silas looked at her. "You looked this up?" "After June mentioned it in the fall, yes." "You didn't say anything." "It wasn't my conversation to have," she said. "It was hers." He looked at June, who was sitting very straight and waiting with the patience of a person who has made a case and understands that the next move belongs to someone else. "It's 15 years away," he said. 14.5, June corrected. "In 14.5 years, the landscape may be completely different," he said. "More schools, different laws, different costs." "Yes," June said. "So we should plan for what we know now and adjust as things change. That's what you do with the ranch, isn't it? You plan for what you know and you adjust." Silas put his fork down. He looked at his daughter, this 7 3/4-year-old who had put on her coat over her nightgown in November to take care of her sister because no one else was available, and something moved across his face that was not quite an expression so much as a change in weather. "We'll start a savings account in Harlow," he said. "I'll put something in it every quarter, whatever I can. It won't be enough on its own, but it'll be a start." June said nothing for a moment. Then, "Really?" "Really," he said, "on the condition that you keep studying, and that you understand the answer to your question might change 10 times between now and then." "I understand that," June said, "and that you keep doing your chores." "Obviously," June said, with a dignity that made Evelyn press her lips together to keep from smiling too openly. They married in May. Not grandly. The circumstances didn't allow for grand, and neither of them wanted grand. They discussed it the way they discussed most things between them now, practically, going through what was necessary versus what was performance, and concluding that the necessary parts were what mattered. The judge came from Harlow on a Thursday, a man named Alderman Fitch, who was in his 60s and had been marrying people in Wyoming for long enough that he'd developed a manner that was brisk without being cold, efficient without feeling rushed. He sat with them in the sitting room the evening before and went over the legal documents with the attention of someone who understood that a marriage was also a legal instrument and deserved to be treated as one. He glanced at Evelyn across his papers. "You've been here since November?" "Yes." "And you're from Pennsylvania originally?" "Ohio originally, Pennsylvania most recently." He made a note. He asked a few more questions, standard questions, the kind that were about establishing who she was in a legal sense rather than in any personal one, and she answered them all directly, and at the end he closed his folder and said the ceremony itself would take about 10 minutes in the morning and they should have a witness present. Wade was the witness. He had come down from Sheridan the week before and had not said much about it, had worked alongside Silas on the spring fencing, had eaten meals at the kitchen table, had read to Millie in the evenings with a solemnity that the baby found deeply amusing, but his presence was the thing. He had come, and being there was the statement. The morning of the ceremony, June woke early and came downstairs in the dress she had chosen herself, a gray wool dress that Evelyn had helped her let out at the hem because she'd grown through the winter, and announced that she had a job, and her job was to hold Millie during the ceremony so that Millie would not be a distraction. "That's thoughtful," Evelyn said. "I'm also your witness for the witness," June said, "even if I'm not official." "That's also thoughtful." June looked at Evelyn's dress. Not a wedding dress, just the best dress she had, a dark blue wool that fit her well and was clean and had been pressed carefully the night before. "You look nice," she said. "Thank you." "Not like a bride," June clarified. "Like yourself, but dressed up." "That's exactly what I was going for," Evelyn said. The ceremony was 10 minutes, as promised. Alderman Fitch said the words with the practiced ease of someone who understood which parts of the language mattered and which were decoration. Silas said his part in the direct, unhurried way he did everything. Evelyn said hers without her voice changing, which she had not been completely certain of until it happened. Wade stood by the window with his arms crossed and watched the whole thing with the expression of a man who had arrived at a conclusion he hadn't expected and was still reconciling himself to the fact that the conclusion was right. June stood beside him with Millie on her hip. Millie was wearing a dress with a ribbon at the collar and was focused entirely on trying to get the ribbon into her mouth, which was ambitious but ultimately unsuccessful. At the end, when Fitch said the final words and looked at Silas, Silas leaned forward and kissed Evelyn once, briefly, on the forehead, which was not the expected location, but was, Evelyn thought, the right one. It felt like a thing he'd decided rather than a thing he was performing. Then it was done. Fitch shook hands with both of them, nodded to Wade, ruffled June's hair in a way she tolerated with visible restraint, and accepted the cup of coffee Evelyn poured him before he left. Wade poured himself one and sat down at the table. "Well," he said. "Well," Silas agreed. "That was efficient," Wade said. "We're efficient people," Evelyn said. He almost smiled. The full smile didn't come. It never quite came with him. But the shape of it was there. June put Millie on the floor and sat down beside her and said, "Now what?" "Now we have breakfast," Evelyn said. "And then your father and I need to look at the South Garden, and you have your Tuesday schoolwork." "It's Thursday," June said. "You're behind on Tuesday's schoolwork," Evelyn said. June made a face that conceded the point. They had breakfast. The years that followed were not a story that moved in a straight line. Evelyn had known this was how it would be. She wasn't a woman who expected straight lines, hadn't been since she was young enough to expect things. But knowing it and living through it were different exercises. And the living through was harder and also more interesting than she'd anticipated. The first drought came the summer after the wedding. July and most of August without meaningful rain, the ground going from dry to cracked, the grass in the south pasture turning the color of old straw. They lost 8 cattle that summer, not to the drought directly, but to the way drought weakened animals who were already working at the edge of their capacity in the Wyoming heat. 8 head of cattle was a number that had financial consequences, and those consequences rolled through the rest of the year like a slow tide. Silas was the kind of man who went quiet under financial pressure. Not cold. He didn't turn that inward tension outward toward her or the girls, but quiet, in a way that had a texture to it, that meant he was running numbers in his head at the supper table and in the dark before sleep. Evelyn started doing the accounts. Not because he asked her to, because she found the ledger on the desk one afternoon and opened it and saw the entries, and saw the way the numbers were arranged, and saw 2 places where a different arrangement would produce a different result. She did the recalculation and put the ledger back. That evening she said, "Can I show you something in the accounts?" He stiffened slightly. "What did you find?" "Nothing wrong," she said, "just a different way to look at it." She showed him. He looked at it for a long time. "Where did you learn to do that?" he said. "I kept books for a shop in Philadelphia for 2 years," she said, "before the seamstress work." He looked at her. "There are things I didn't put in the letters," she said. "Not the things you already know about. Just, I had a lot of jobs. I learned a lot of different things." "What else?" "I can set a bone, if it's not complicated. I understand basic contract language. I know how to negotiate with a supplier if you go in knowing what you need and what you'll walk away from." She paused. "I wasn't trying to hide any of it. It just didn't seem relevant until it was." He was quiet. "Are you annoyed?" she said. "No," he said. "I'm thinking about how many problems you could have solved 6 months ago if I'd known." "Well," she said, "now you know." She took over the accounts. She wasn't a professional bookkeeper. She was careful to understand that limit. But she brought the same systematic attention to the numbers that she brought to fever management and fence repair and kitchen gardens, and the accounts got cleaner and the decisions got more legible. And by the end of the drought year, the financial picture was worse than they'd hoped, but clearer than it had been, which turned out to be more useful. You couldn't solve a problem you couldn't see the shape of. There were arguments. She had expected this, but had not expected the specific shapes they would take. The ones about money were familiar. She'd had those with herself, essentially, for years, and having them with another person was at least more efficient. The ones about the girls were different. The first real argument was about Millie. Millie, at 2, was fearless in the specific way of a child who had survived something early and come out the other side of it without learning the lesson that she was supposed to. She climbed things. She went toward dogs she didn't know without apparent concern. She walked toward the paddock fence with a focused interest in the horses that suggested she saw no meaningful distinction between herself and a grown adult with the physical capability to manage a 1,200-pound animal. Silas's response to this was restriction. Rules. An expanding list of things Millie was not to do or go near. Evelyn's response was different. "She needs to learn it," Evelyn said, one evening after Millie had gotten through the paddock gate somehow, and walked directly up to the near horse before June noticed and intervened. "Not avoid it. Learn it." "She's 2, Silas said. "She can't learn it." "She's learning everything else at 2. She's learning language and how to use a spoon, and that hot means don't touch. She can learn this too, with the right teaching." With horses, the wrong teaching is a child with a broken skull. "I'm not suggesting you let her wander in alone. I'm suggesting you take her in with you, on purpose, and show her the difference between what's safe and what isn't." Evelyn looked at him directly. "Keeping her away from everything she's drawn to won't make her less drawn to it. It'll just mean she goes when no one's watching." The silence after that had an edge to it. "You're saying I'm handling my daughter wrong," he said. "I'm saying you're handling her fear wrong," she said, "because it's your fear mostly, which is understandable, but it's not working." He walked out of the kitchen. He came back an hour later and didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything, and supper happened in that particular quiet that follows an argument where one side was right and both sides know it, but nobody is ready to say so. The next morning, she looked out the kitchen window and saw Silas in the paddock, Millie on his hip, the near horse at a distance. Silas talking to the child, and then walking slowly toward the animal, letting Millie watch, letting her understand the approach before the contact. She watched them for a moment. Then she went back to the stove. The argument she hadn't expected was about her name. A woman in Harlow. Not malicious, just careless, or possibly careless in a way that was performing innocence, had said something at the general store about Evelyn's history. Not to Evelyn directly. To the woman next to her, in the way people said things they wanted heard without being responsible for saying them. The words Evelyn caught were Philadelphia, and that business with the married man and the rest of it she didn't need to hear because she knew the sentence by heart. She had paid for her flour and her salt and left without giving the woman the satisfaction of her reaction. She told Silas that evening. He went to the general store the next morning without saying he was going. He came back an hour later. "What did you do?" Evelyn said when she saw his face. "I talked to Harriet Voss," he said. "I told her that my wife's history in Philadelphia had been investigated and cleared, and that I had documentation to that effect, and that if she was going to talk about members of my family in her store, I'd be doing my shopping in the next town." Evelyn looked at him. "You didn't ask me first," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't. It's my history, my name. You don't get to defend it without asking me. It's also my family," he said, "and my name now, technically. That doesn't—" She stopped, started again. "I have been managing that story for 4 years, Silas. I know how to manage it. I know when to fight it and when to let it run itself out. You walking in there and making a declaration might have solved something, or it might have handed her something more interesting to talk about. I don't know yet which one you did." He was quiet. "You should have asked me," she said. "Not because I would have necessarily said no, because it was mine to decide." He looked at his hands. "You're right," he said. "I know you're right." "Then say it like you mean it, and not like you're agreeing to end the argument." He looked up at her. "I'm saying it because I mean it. You were managing that long before I knew you existed, and I walked into your business without permission, and I should have asked." The tension in the room shifted. "Was she terrible about it?" Evelyn asked. "She was embarrassed," he said. "Which is worse, probably. She'll either be more careful or more pointed. I don't know which." "She'll be more careful," Evelyn said. "People like that don't like being caught. It makes the whole thing less fun." She exhaled. "What documentation did you reference?" "Wade's letter. The legal summary." She nodded. "All right. All right as in it's resolved, or all right as in you're done talking about it for now? All right as in you did something without asking me, and it may or may not have helped, and we both have to live with that," she said. "Which is just marriage, I think." He considered this. "That's not a very satisfying resolution." "No," she agreed, "but it's accurate." He sat down at the table with the air of a man learning something about the difference between wanting to protect someone and knowing how to. She poured him coffee and sat across from him, and they drank it together in the quiet that came after arguments when both people were still in the room and hadn't left. That was something, she had decided, that both of them stayed in the room. June turned 14 the spring that a man named Garrett Holloway came through Harlow. Evelyn recognized the name before she recognized the connection, and then the connection arrived like cold water. Holloway. The man in Sheridan who had told Wade about her history. The man who had heard the story somewhere and carried it north. He was in Harlow for business, something to do with cattle brokering. And he was at the Harlow Hotel, and the name reached the Black Ridge Ranch through the ordinary channels of small-town information, which moved faster and with more accuracy than people gave it credit for. Silas told her at breakfast. She put her coffee cup down. "I want to talk to him," she said. Silas was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "Because I want to know where he heard the story," she said. "Because if it came from someone with a continuing interest in spreading it, I want to know that. And because I'm tired of letting things happen to me from a distance." He looked at her for a long moment. "Do you want me to come?" "Yes," she said. "But let me lead it." "Of course," he said, as if it had never been a question. They went to Harlow on a Wednesday. Garrett Holloway was a man in his mid-40s, soft in the way that men got soft when they'd been selling rather than building for 20 years. with the watchful eyes of someone who'd learned to read a room before entering it. He saw them coming across the hotel lobby and something moved in his expression. Not guilt, exactly, but recognition. Evelyn sat across from him and said, "You told a man named Wade Creed a story about me 2 years ago." Holloway folded his hands on the table. "Mrs. Creed." He said the name carefully. "I didn't know at the time that you were—" "Where did you hear it?" she said. A pause. "A man in Kansas City. I do business there regularly. He knew the Beaumont family." "Arthur Beaumont specifically?" "His wife's brother," Holloway said. "A man named Cole Whitfield. He told it as a cautionary tale about women who—" He stopped, apparently registering that the sentence had nowhere good to go. "About women who what?" she said. He looked at the table. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it, and then I want you to make your own decision about what to do with it." She put Wade's document on the table between them. Not as a weapon, not as a threat, just as information being placed where it needed to be. "The story Cole Whitfield told you was constructed by a family with enough money and influence to construct whatever story served them best. Arthur Beaumont did to me what he had previously done to 2 other women in 2 other cities. The ring I was accused of stealing was never reported missing through any official channel other than the legal action against me. I was acquitted cleanly. The family has continued, in the years since, to ensure that the version of events they prefer continues to circulate." Holloway looked at the document. He picked it up and read it slowly and put it down. "I didn't know any of that," he said. "I know you didn't," she said. "That's not why I'm here. I'm here because you're a man who moves through multiple cities and does business with multiple people, and you hear things and you repeat them, the way people do. And I'm asking you, now that you know the fuller picture, to be more careful with this particular story when it comes up again. Because it will come up again. Stories like this always do." Holloway was quiet. "You're not threatening me," he said. "Not a question." "I'm not," she said. "I'm asking you. There's a difference." He looked at her, and then at us, who had been sitting in the same posture the whole time, present, still, letting her run it exactly as she'd asked. "All right," Holloway said. "Fair enough." She put the document back in her coat pocket and stood up. "Thank you for your time," she said. They walked out of the hotel and into the Harlow Main Street, which was doing its ordinary Wednesday business around them, and Silas walked beside her and said nothing until they got to the wagon. Then he said, "That was well done." "It may not matter," she said. "He may still tell it." "He may," Silas agreed, "but he'll tell it differently." She thought about that. "Yes, I think he will." She climbed onto the wagon seat. Silas climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. "I want you to know something," he said, "in case I don't say it clearly enough other times." He was looking at the horse's ears while he said it, which was his way of saying something he hadn't fully rehearsed. "When I sent for you, I was a man who needed help. That was all it was, at the beginning. I'm not going to pretend it was more than that. I needed someone to help me with the girls and the house, and I couldn't do it alone." "I know that," she said. "What I didn't know," he said, "was that I was going to get someone who would walk into a hotel in Harlow and tell a man the truth about her own life with that much of herself." He looked at her. "I didn't know it was going to be you specifically, and I want to say that clearly, that it being you specifically has made a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're not easy either," she said. "I know. You go quiet when you're worried, and I have to work out what you're worried about from context clues. You make decisions about my business without asking and then feel bad about it, but still do it again. You love those girls so much you sometimes can't see them clearly." "I know all of that," he said. "I'm not complaining," she said. "I'm just making sure we're being accurate." "Accurate," he said. "It being you specifically has made a difference to me as well," she said, "in case that also needed saying." He flicked the reins. The horses started forward. They drove home through the Wyoming spring, through the budding grass and the wide sky, and the road they both knew well enough now to travel without thinking about it, and the conversation settled into the easy quiet that long marriages built. Not emptiness, but the kind of quiet that meant everything important had been said, and the day could go on. 7 years after the stage had pulled into Harlow, and Hank had charged her $2.50 for the ride to a ranch she'd never seen, Evelyn stood on the back porch of Black Ridge Ranch in the early morning and watched the world happen. Silas was at the fence line on the far side of the south pasture, a small figure in the distance doing the slow, deliberate work of a man who understood that a ranch was held together by 10,000 small maintenance decisions made before anyone else was awake. She could see the movement of his arms, the particular way he held his shoulders. June was at the kitchen table behind her, studying. She was 14 now, with her father's jaw and her mother's eyes. Evelyn had seen a photograph of Clara by now, from the box in the hall closet that had finally been opened, quietly, one afternoon when Silas had been ready. And she was studying with the focused intensity of someone who understood that the savings account in Harlow and the medical school in Chicago were real things, not dreams, and that the distance between them was filled with exactly this: books and attention, and not giving up when the material was hard. She'd been up since 6. She hadn't needed to be told. Millie was running across the pasture toward her father, because Millie was always running toward something or away from something, and the distinction was less important to her than the running itself. She was 2.5 years old, and she called Evelyn Mama with the full confidence of a child who had never had reason to question the word. And the first time she'd said it, the very first time, on an unremarkable Tuesday, reaching up for Evelyn from the kitchen floor. Evelyn had stood very still for a moment and felt something move through her that she hadn't known to prepare for. She watched Millie reach Silas at the fence and Silas bend down to pick her up, the distant shape of him lifting the child against the morning sky. She thought about who she had been when she'd stepped off the stage in Harlow. A woman with $31 and a damaged reputation and a piece of paper with an address on it. A woman who had spent 4 years measuring every road by how quickly she could leave it if she needed to. She thought about the woman in the Philadelphia courtroom who had been acquitted of a theft she hadn't committed and walked out into a street full of people who had already decided. She thought about the boarding house in Ridgecroft where she'd waited out the broken axle, lying awake asking herself whether any of this was a mistake. She thought about a baby crying behind a door she hadn't knocked on. The thing she understood now, 7 years into a life she hadn't designed and wouldn't have chosen from a catalog, was that the decision hadn't been made in any single moment. Not when she'd picked up Millie, not when she'd told Wade the truth about her past, or when Silas had said you stay across the cold sitting room, or when she'd stood in front of Judge Fitch in her best blue dress and said the words. The decision had been made in aggregate, in the 10,000 small moments of not leaving, in the fires rebuilt and the fevers managed, and the arguments that ended with both people still in the room. In the savings account in Harlow, and the document from Kansas City, and the fence repaired from the right angle with the right nails. Nobody arrived somewhere like this all at once. You got there one morning at a time, one cup of coffee left on the counter at a time, one thing done without being asked at a time, until one day you looked up, and the place you'd arrived at was too real and too built to be anything other than home. She had not found a place where her past couldn't follow her. She had found something she hadn't known to look for. People who looked at the past and the present together and chose her based on all of it. Not despite the Philadelphia story, but with full knowledge of it. Not because she was uncomplicated, but because the specific shape of her complications had turned out to fit the specific shape of what this family needed. And that was a kind of luck so precise and so unlikely that she'd stopped calling it luck and started calling it hers. Inside, June's chair scraped back from the table. "Evelyn," June called, "is there more coffee?" "There's half a pot," she called back. "It's been sitting a while." "Good enough," June said. Evelyn heard the sound of the cup being poured, the particular small domesticity of it, and she stayed on the porch one more moment in the early morning light. Silas was walking back from the fence line now, Millie on his hip, both of them small against the big Wyoming sky, moving toward the house. She watched them come and felt the old habit, the assessment of exits, the instinct toward readiness, and felt it for what it was. A reflex from a different life, less useful here than it used to be, loosening its grip 1 year at a time. She didn't feel the urge to leave. She felt instead the particular weight of a place that had become specific. Not any house, not any ranch, but this house, this ranch, the one with the stove draft she'd fixed, and the porch railing Wade had shown her how to nail, and the kitchen garden she'd turned over and planted and replanted 4 springs running. A person could spend their whole life looking for a place that would take them as they were. Most people didn't find it. She had. Not because she'd been exceptional, or because she'd done everything right. She hadn't. and she knew the list of her errors and kept it honest. But because she'd made one decision that turned out to matter more than she'd known at the time. When she'd heard a baby crying behind a closed door in a cold house, she'd opened the door instead of walking past it. Everything that came after had grown from that. Silas came through the yard gate. Millie saw Evelyn on the porch and raised both arms in the imperious gesture of a child who wanted to be transferred and considered it a reasonable request. Evelyn went down the porch steps and took her. Millie grabbed a handful of her hair immediately, which she always did, and said something that was half word and half noise and entirely confident that it had been understood. "Good morning to you too," Evelyn said. Silas stopped beside her. He looked at her the way he looked at her sometimes, not dramatically, not with declaration, just with the quiet attentiveness of a man who had learned to look clearly at the things he valued. "Good morning," he said. "The south fence?" she said. "Holding," he said. "The cattle?" "All accounted for." "Then come inside," she said. "June is drinking the old coffee." He followed her up the porch steps and through the door, into the kitchen where June was at the table with her books and her old coffee and her future in Chicago that was 14 years away and real, and the house took them in the way houses did when they'd been filled long enough to know the people in them. The door closed behind them. Outside, the Wyoming morning went on. Enormous, indifferent, beautiful in the way that places are beautiful when they don't know they're being looked at. And the ranch sat in the middle of it, held together by 10,000 decisions, and one woman who had learned, at last, that staying was its own kind of courage. Not the loud kind, not the kind anyone would write about or remember from the outside. The kind that showed up every morning and lit the stove and began again. That kind.